The morning Harlan Briggs rode onto Caleb Whitmore's property, he didn't knock. He never knocked. Men like Harlan Briggs didn't knock on doors they intended to own. Came with two riders behind him, both of them sitting their horses the way hired men do. When they've been told, they won't need to say a word, just be present. Just be large. Just remind a tired man of how alone he really is. The snow was still falling in fine, dry sheets, the kind that doesn't accumulate so much as it settles into every crack and crevice, into the collar of your coat, into the gap between your boot and your heel. Caleb's oldest, a boy of 9 named Thomas, saw them first through the frost-edged window. He didn't run to tell his father. He just stood there, watching, and even at 9 he understood enough about the way the world worked to feel his stomach go cold. Harlan Briggs pulled a folded document from inside his coat, like a man drawing a card he'd been holding since the beginning of the game. He didn't hand it to Caleb. He held it open and read from it himself, slowly, as though Caleb might need a moment to understand the longer words. The document said the Whitmore property, all 412 acres of it, the house, the barn, the south pasture, the creek rights was now collateral claimed by the Consolidated Western Land Company for failure to repay a debt of $940, principal and accumulated interest, the balance of which had been due 11 days prior. Caleb said he hadn't received any notice. Harlan said that wasn't his concern. Caleb said he needed more time. Harlan folded the document back into his coat with the practiced ease of a man who had done this particular thing many times before, in many different dooryards, to many different men, who all used the same words in the same order. I didn't receive notice. I need more time. He looked at Caleb the way a man looks at something. He's already decided to step over and said that the company would expect the property vacated by the 1st of March, which gave him. He paused, making a show of calculating 6 weeks. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the lane without another word, his 2 riders falling in behind him, and the snow kept falling, and Thomas Whitmore pressed his forehead against the cold glass and watched them go. If you've ever stood in a place that used to feel like yours and felt it become foreign while you were still standing in it, then you already know something about what this story is. Stay with me. What happens next to this family, to a man who had already lost more than most people lose in a lifetime, and to the woman who arrived on a February train with nothing but a single suitcase and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't announce itself? It will stay with you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next, and hit that like button if you believe a person can arrive as a stranger and still save an entire family. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it really began. Caleb Whitmore had not always been a man who received bad news without flinching. There had been a version of him, not so many years ago, who would have argued. Who would have found the anger quickly, let it rise clean and useful, and done something with it. But grief has a way of reaching into a person and rearranging things. And by the winter of 1894, Caleb's anger lived somewhere he couldn't easily access, buried under exhaustion and under the particular weight of raising 2 children alone, in a place that tried on a fairly regular basis to kill everyone living in it. He was 34 years old, and he looked older. Not old in any dramatic way, not ravaged or broken, just used. The way good tools get used, worn at the edges, in ways that speak to how much work has been asked of them. His hands were a catalog of small scars and healed-over cuts. His shoulders had the forward set of a man who spent most of his day bent into some task or another. He had brown hair that needed cutting and hadn't gotten it, and eyes the color of creek water in late fall, that particular gray-green that isn't quite either thing. His wife, May, had died 16 months ago. Fever, the doctor said, though the doctor was 70 miles away in Missoula and had not actually seen her. Caleb had sat with her through 4 days and 4 nights of it, watching the thing that was happening to her, and unable to stop any of it. She had been 29. She had been, in Caleb's estimation, the most competent person he had ever known, and he had loved her in the inarticulate way that men of his particular type loved, not with words, not with demonstrations, but with a thoroughgoing, daily devotion that expressed itself in small acts, and in the fact that he never once, in 7 years of marriage, stopped paying attention to her. After she died, the ranch began to die too, not dramatically. Slowly, the way a fire dies when you stop feeding it, not out all at once, but contracting, growing smaller, pulling inward. The south pasture fence came down in a windstorm in October, and Caleb didn't have the money to replace the posts, so he patched it with wire and rope and hoped it would hold through winter. It mostly did. The root cellar had a section of wall that had gone soft with moisture, and he'd shored it up with boards. But he knew come spring it would need real work. Cattle he'd had 23 head going into last winter, and now he had 17. One he'd had to sell, 2 had died in a cold snap in November, and 3 others he'd been forced to butcher earlier than planned, because he simply didn't have enough feed to carry them. The money from the butchering had gone to flour and sugar and lamp oil, and the payment the schoolteacher required for Thomas's lessons. Thomas was 9. His sister Clara was 6. They were good children, which is to say they were real children. Thomas prone to a sullenness that came and went without obvious cause. Clara given to a stubborn attachment to small objects and routines that Caleb found both touching and occasionally maddening. They both slept in the loft above the main room, and on very cold nights Caleb sometimes woke in the dark and lay still and listened for the sound of their breathing, just to be sure. He had placed the advertisement in late October, 3 weeks after May's 16th month anniversary, on a night when Clara had cried at supper because she couldn't remember what her mother's voice had sounded like. He had not made the decision calmly or rationally. He had made it the way exhausted people make many of their decisions in a moment of clarity that arrives, not from deliberation, but from a kind of bottoming out, where the options that were previously unthinkable suddenly become the only ones left. The advertisement had been simple. He was not a man given to elaboration. Widowed rancher, Montana Territory, 2 children, seeks practical woman of good character willing to relocate, hard work guaranteed, fair treatment certain. He'd stared at those 2 sentences for a long time before he folded the paper and sent it to the agency in Chicago. He felt ridiculous. He also felt that feeling ridiculous was a luxury he couldn't afford. The response came 6 weeks later, a single letter, written in a handwriting that was neat without being fussy, the handwriting of someone who had been taught correctly and had retained the lessons without adding any unnecessary ornamentation. Her name was Eleanor Whitaker. She was 26, from a town called Millhaven in upstate New York, the daughter of a surveyor who had died 2 years prior. She had been keeping house for a distant cousin's family since her father's death, a situation she described, without self-pity but also without any attempt to dress it up, as not particularly sustainable. She said she was not afraid of cold weather or hard work. She said she could cook, preserve, sew, tend animals, and keep accounts. She said she was not looking to be rescued. She was looking for a situation where her efforts would matter. Caleb read the letter twice, then put it away in the small wooden box where he kept important papers, and did not take it back out for 4 days. Then he took it out and read it again and wrote back. They exchanged 3 letters over 6 weeks. None of them were romantic in any conventional sense. They were more like negotiations, candid, specific, as occasionally uncomfortable in their directness. She asked him how bad the debt situation was. He told her, with the exactness of a man who had no interest in misleading someone into a worse situation than they were already anticipating. She told him she had no money to bring, and that she hoped that was not disqualifying. He said it was not. She said she would arrive on the 14th of February on the afternoon train. He told Thomas and Clara 2 weeks before she was set to arrive. Thomas received the information with the careful blankness of a child who has learned that important things require a period of processing before he knows how he feels about them. Clara asked, immediately and without hesitation, whether Eleanor would be able to braid hair, because Caleb was not good at braiding hair, and Clara had specific feelings about this. Caleb said he didn't know. Clara said he should have asked. He drove the wagon into Hamilton on the morning of the 14th, arriving at the station 2 hours early because the road was bad and he'd allowed for it. And then the road had been fine, which left him standing on the platform in the cold, with nothing to do but think, which was not something he particularly wanted to do. Hamilton was not a large town. It had grown up along the Bitterroot Valley with the particular haphazard energy of frontier settlements, main street of businesses that ranged from solid to provisional, a church, a school, a livery, 3 saloons that Caleb could name, and probably 1 or 2 more that kept a lower profile. The people who lived there had the look of people who had made a commitment, not always cheerfully, to stay. They watched each other's business with the attentiveness of communities that have very little else to watch. The station master, a stout man named Grover Finch, came out to sweep the platform at some point, and noticed standing there, and gave him the kind of look that contains a question it doesn't intend to ask out loud. Caleb nodded. Finch went back inside. The train was 12 minutes late. When it came in, Caleb watched the doors and tried not to look like he was watching the doors. 3 men got off, then a woman with a child, then an older couple moving slowly with a great deal of luggage, then a pause, and then Eleanor Whitaker stepped down onto the platform. And Caleb's first thought, which he was not proud of, was that she was not what he'd pictured. He hadn't formed a very specific picture. He'd told himself he hadn't. But whatever indefinite impression he'd been carrying dissolved immediately and was replaced by the actual person, which was always a more complicated thing. She was medium height, dark-haired under a gray wool hat that had seen better years, wearing a coat that was good quality but old, carried a small leather suitcase in one hand, and had a canvas bag over her shoulder. She stepped off the train and looked at the platform with the assessing, systematic gaze of someone taking inventory. And then she looked directly at Caleb, and he had the unsettling impression that she had identified him immediately and with very little difficulty. She walked toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Not a question, Miss Whitaker," he said. They shook hands. Her grip was firm and her hand was cold. She looked at him steadily for a moment, not rudely, but with a frankness that most women in his experience did not deploy this quickly, and then she looked past him at the wagon and the horse and the gray, frozen world beyond the station, and whatever assessment she was making, she made it without sharing it. "Long ride?" she asked. "About 2 hours," he said. "Road's not bad today." "Good," she said. Then before he could move to take her suitcase, "I've got it." He hadn't expected that either. They didn't talk much on the ride back. Not from awkwardness, exactly more from a mutual recognition that they were both people who did not feel compelled to fill silence. The valley rolled out around them, white and gray, and still the mountains against the sky, looking like something a person had painted, and then left incomplete. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched the land with a focused attention that he found himself noticing. Most people, arriving in this country for the first time, reacted to it with some version of intimidation, the scale of it, the blankness of it in winter. She just looked at it as though she was memorizing it. After about 40 minutes, she said, "Tell me about the creek." He glanced at her. "What about it? In your letter you mentioned creek rights. I want to understand what that means for the property. Who's upstream?" It was such an unexpectedly practical question that he answered it fully and without thinking, explaining the water situation, the Harden family upstream, their long-standing informal agreement. Times it had been a problem, and the times it hadn't. She listened without interrupting and asked 2 follow-up questions that suggested she understood more about property and water rights than he would have assumed. When he said as much, she said her father had been a surveyor, and she'd spent a fair amount of her childhood watching him work and listening to him explain things. "What kind of survey work?" Caleb asked. "Land claims, mostly. Boundary disputes. Some work for the territorial government when he could get it." She paused. He was good at it. Very precise. He kept meticulous records of everything. She said it simply, without the weight of grief on it. But Caleb heard the past tense and knew what it meant to have a parent reduced to what they were, rather than what they are. "How long ago?" he asked. 2 years in March," she said. He nodded. They let that sit for a moment in the cold air between them. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you," she said, in a way that meant she'd heard it before, and it had ceased to help very much, but she understood why people said it. Thomas and Clara were both in the house when they arrived. Thomas by design, and Clara because she had been told firmly that she was to stay inside and not run out into the yard the moment she heard the wagon, a directive she had followed, with the specific brittle compliance of a child holding herself back by force of will. The moment Eleanor came through the door, Clara looked at her with the wide, grave assessment of a 6-year-old, taking the measure of someone who is about to become important. Eleanor looked back at her with equal seriousness, and then said, not in the bright, chirpy tone that adults sometimes use with children, and that children universally recognize as false, "You must be Clara. Your father told me you have opinions about braiding." Clara stared at her. "He said that?" "He said he wasn't good at it, and that you had feelings about this. That tells me you have opinions." Clara thought about this. "I do," she admitted. "So do I," Eleanor said. "We'll figure out if they're compatible." Thomas, from across the room, watched this exchange with the studied neutrality of a 9-year-old who has decided not to be charmed yet. Eleanor looked at him next. She didn't try to be warm in a way that would put him off. She just said, "Thomas, I'd shake your hand, but I expect that seems odd. I'll just say it's good to meet you, and leave it there." Thomas, who had been preparing for something he'd need to resist, found himself slightly wrong-footed by the absence of anything to resist. Oki said. And then because he was 9 and could not entirely suppress his own curiosity, were you on the train a long time? 2 days, Eleanor said. Was it bad? Parts of it. Which parts? Ohio, she said, without hesitation. And Thomas, despite himself, almost smiled. The house was what it was. Caleb had cleaned it as thoroughly as he knew how to clean it, which was not thoroughly enough, though he'd tried. Eleanor moved through it in those first hours with a quiet practicality that was neither critical nor willfully blind. She simply noted things, registered them, filed them away for later without comment. Cast iron stove needed new blacking, and one of the burner lids was cracked. The floor had been swept but not scrubbed in some time. The root cellar, which she asked to see before supper, had the deteriorating wall section Caleb already knew about, and she stood and looked at it for a moment and said they'd need to address it before the spring thaw, or they'd lose the whole thing. He said he knew. She said, not unkindly, I'm not criticizing. I'm taking inventory. I know, he said. Good, she said, and went back up the stairs. Supper that first night was stiff in the way that first nights always are too much awareness of everyone's placement at the table. Too many small moments of uncertain protocol. Caleb had made a stew which was about the extent of his cooking range, and it was fine. Eleanor ate it without complaint and said it was good, which he believed was not entirely true but was gracious. Clara talked more than she usually did at meals, which Caleb suspected was both nerves and a form of claiming territory. Thomas ate in his careful way and occasionally looked at Eleanor sideways, measuring something. After supper, Eleanor washed the dishes without being asked. Caleb said he usually did them himself, and she said that was fine and she'd help. They washed dishes side by side in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and Caleb thought about the fact that this was the first time another adult had stood in this kitchen with him in 16 months, and the thought landed somewhere complicated in his chest. Clara came and stood in the doorway and watched them and said, "Is Eleanor sleeping in your room?" Caleb had prepared for this. He had prepared for exactly this. "Eleanor will have the room off the back," he said. The small room that had been used for storage, which he had cleared and set up with a bed and a chest of drawers in the preceding week. Clara considered this. "That room is cold," she said. "There's an extra quilt," Caleb said. Clara looked at Eleanor. "I have a quilt with blue patches. You can borrow it if yours isn't warm enough." Eleanor looked at Clara for a moment. "That's kind of you," she said. "Thank you." Clara nodded gravely as though a contract had been proposed and accepted, and went back to the main room. Caleb looked at the dish in his hands and did not say anything. Eleanor also did not say anything. They finished the dishes. The first week was about learning the rhythms of the place. Not just the practical rhythms when the fire needed tending, when the animals needed feeding, what the water situation was like at the pump, but the deeper rhythms, the ones that told you how a household had been running and what it needed. Eleanor was good at this. She was good at seeing systems, at understanding how things connected to each other, and at figuring out, without being told, which problems were recent and which were structural. The garden situation, which she assessed on the third morning by standing in the snow-covered patch behind the house and looking at it with her arms crossed, was bad but not hopeless. From the raised beds that May she didn't call her. May she called her your wife, which Caleb appreciated for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate, had known what she was doing, and had laid good groundwork. The soil wasn't exhausted. It had just been left alone too long and was now compacted and partially killed off. With the right attention starting in March, she thought they could salvage it for a reasonable spring planting. "What did she grow?" Eleanor asked. Caleb thought about it. "Potatoes, onions, beans. She tried tomatoes one year, but they didn't take. Squash, smart choices for this altitude," Eleanor said. "Did she put anything in the ground for overwintering?" "I don't know," Caleb said. "She might have. I didn't tend it after." Eleanor nodded. She looked at the garden for another moment and then looked at him. "We'll dig it out in March and see what we find," she said. "Sometimes there's more surviving than you'd expect." He understood she was not only talking about the garden, and he was not sure how he felt about that. Town took notice of her arrival, of course. Hamilton was small enough that a new arrival of any kind would have generated attention, and a mail-order bride for the Whitmore place generated the specific, avid kind. The women at the dry goods store, Marta Gruen and her daughter Lottie, who worked the counter most days, had noticed Eleanor on her second visit into town and had formed and communicated opinions before she'd cleared the threshold. Not loudly. This was a culture of sideways assessments, and voices dropped to just below carrying distance, which was in some ways more corrosive than open hostility because it was harder to address. Eleanor was aware of it. She was not naive about social dynamics, and she'd grown up in a small town of her own where these mechanisms operated with the same basic efficiency. She didn't try to win anyone over immediately. She was polite. She was direct. She paid for her purchases without excessive conversation, and she left. She was not performing indifference to what was said about her. She simply understood that she was not going to be able to control what people said in the first weeks, and she declined to spend energy on things she couldn't control. What she didn't know yet was that the resistance was going to have teeth. The first person to actually say something to her face was a woman named Dorothea Meeks, whose husband owned the largest spread in the valley, 1,100 acres running up toward the eastern foothills. Dorothea Meeks was a woman of 50 who had arrived in Montana at 22 as a young bride and had survived things that had broken harder people. She had emerged from those experiences with strong opinions and the conviction that she'd earned the right to voice them. She was not a cruel woman, but she was not particularly careful with how she used her frankness. Caught Eleanor at the feed store, 4 days after Eleanor's arrival, when Eleanor had come in to ask about spring seed prices and to understand what the market looked like for the coming year. Dorothea Meeks looked Eleanor over in that particular way of an older woman assessing a younger one she isn't sure about. "You're the one Caleb Whitmore sent away for," she said. "Not unkindly, exactly, but not gently." "I'm Eleanor Whitaker," Eleanor said. "I arrived last week. I know when you arrived. The whole county knows when you arrived." Dorothea paused. "You know what people are saying. I expect I can guess. They're saying no woman who answers an advertisement is coming out here for any good reason. That either she's desperate or she's running from something." Eleanor met her eyes. "And what do you think?" Dorothea studied her for a moment. "I think desperate women built this territory," she said. "And I think running from something isn't the worst reason to arrive somewhere." A pause. "But I also think that Caleb Whitmore has had enough taken from him. And if you're not what you say you are, you'll find men in this valley who take exception to that." "I understand," Eleanor said. "Do you?" Dorothea looked at her steadily. "He's not a simple man to understand. And those children have been through enough." "I know that," Eleanor said. "I'm not here to be understood. I'm here to work." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then she gave a small, unsmiling nod that was not quite approval but was possibly the beginning of it. "Buy the winter rye," she said. "If you're planning a spring garden, it's already half done, and the price will be better." Then she turned and walked out, and Eleanor stood in the feed store and let out a slow, careful breath. It was in the second week that Eleanor found the papers. She hadn't been looking for anything in particular. She had been going through the small room off the kitchen that Caleb used as a study, a generous word for a space that held a battered desk, a crate of supplies, and a chaotic accumulation of receipts, letters, and documents that had clearly not been organized in quite some time. She was looking for the deed to the property, which she'd asked Caleb about, and which he'd waved toward the room with the vague confidence of a man who knows a thing exists somewhere without being sure of exactly where. She found the deed. She also found under a stack of receipts a smaller bundle of papers tied with string that was not from the Consolidated Western Land Company and was not from any bank in Hamilton. Papers were older, the edges darkened, the folds deep and permanent, and the handwriting was not Caleb's. Untied the string and read the first page, and then she stopped and read it again. She put the papers down on the desk and sat very still for a moment. Then she picked them up and read them again, more carefully, from the beginning. They were survey documents, old ones from the mid-1880s, she estimated by the date on the second page. They were signed with a notation she recognized the style of immediately, because she had seen that particular style of notation her entire childhood, her father's. Her father had surveyed this land. Not Caleb's parcel specifically, but the larger grid, the section that included Caleb's property and the surrounding parcels, 4 or 5 properties at a minimum. And in the margins of those documents, in her father's careful and precise handwriting, were notes, not standard survey notes, annotations, questions. In one place, circled 3 times, boundary discrepancy, eastern claim, see attached. In another, more alarming, recorded deed inconsistent with original territorial grant appears duplicated. Report filed. Eleanor sat in the cold little room for a long time. The fire had died down and she hadn't noticed it dying. She held the papers and thought about the letter that had brought her here, the letter from the agency that had included Caleb's brief description, and she thought about why she had answered it. She had told Caleb the truth. She was looking for a situation where her efforts would matter. She had not told him the other truth, the fuller one, that when she had received the agency's list of advertisers and seen Montana territory among them, she had felt something pull that she couldn't entirely explain, because her father had spent 3 years of correspondence with someone in the Montana territory before his death correspondence he had kept in a separate box, locked, which she had only opened after he died. And in those letters he had described the same type of land fraud she was now reading about in these margin notes, and he had died before he could do anything about it. She had not come to Montana only because she needed a new situation. She had come because she had promised herself she would finish what her father had started. She had not expected to find his handwriting waiting for her in a drawer. She retied the string around the papers and held the bundle in her lap and looked at the closed door of the study and thought about how to begin. That evening, after the children were in the loft and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Eleanor came and sat at the table across from Caleb, who was mending a piece of harness by lamplight. She put the bundle on the table between them. "Where did these come from?" she asked. Caleb looked at the papers and then looked at her. May's father left them when he came through years back. He was a surveyor, worked the territory. He paused. "She kept them. I kept them because she kept them. I never knew what exactly they meant." Eleanor looked at the bundle. "The man who made these notes," she said, "was my father." Caleb set down the harness. He looked at her carefully, with the alertness of someone who is trying to understand whether they have misheard something. "Say that again." "James Whitaker. He was a land surveyor. He worked in Montana in the mid-1880s. She kept her voice even. "These are his annotations. I know his notation style. I grew up watching him work." "Your father," Caleb said slowly, "surveyed the land around this property." "Yes, and left documents about it." "Yes." Caleb looked at the bundle for a long moment. "Why?" Eleanor untied the string and laid the top paper flat on the table between them, and she began to explain what she saw in the margins, and why it mattered, and why she thought it was connected to the Consolidated Western Land Company that had come to his door. She explained it the way her father had explained things to her when she was young, clearly, specifically, without condescension, but also without assuming prior knowledge. She showed him the discrepancy notations. She showed him the word duplicated circled 3 times. Caleb listened without interrupting. He was a man who listened well when something actually warranted it. When she finished, the lamp had burned lower and the fire needed a log. Neither of them moved to tend it. "How long have you known about this?" Caleb asked. "Before you came." Eleanor held his gaze. "I knew my father had been corresponding about land fraud in the territory. I didn't know it was here. Not until I read these tonight." Quiet for a moment. "Did you come here because of this?" "I came here because I needed a different situation, and because this place felt connected to my father's work," she said. "That's both things at once. I'm not going to pretend one is more true than the other." Caleb looked at her for a long time. The fire popped. Thomas shifted in the loft above them, and they both reflexively looked up and waited to see if he'd wake, and he didn't. "You could have told me this in the letters," Caleb said. "I could have," Eleanor agreed. "I didn't know how much I could trust you with it yet." And now she looked at him steadily. "Now I know enough." Caleb picked up the top survey document and looked at it for a moment, at the careful handwriting in the margins, and then he set it down and picked up the harness again. He didn't say anything for a while. Eleanor waited. "What do we do with them?" he finally asked. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know they matter. And I know Harlan Briggs doesn't know they exist." The fire was down to coals. Eleanor got up and put a log on it and adjusted the damper, and the flame caught again slowly, and the lamplight shifted and settled, and outside the wind was picking up across the valley and driving snow against the south-facing wall of the house. And Caleb Whitmore sat at his table in the renewed warmth and looked at the bundle of papers and thought about a woman he had never met, whose careful handwriting was sitting in his kitchen, and about the daughter that woman had sent him. He had thought, when he placed the advertisement, that he was asking for help. He was beginning to understand that what had arrived was something considerably more than that, and he wasn't sure yet whether to be frightened by it or grateful. Possibly, he thought both. Possibly that was exactly right. The wind pressed against the house and the fire held, and upstairs his children slept, and across the table, Eleanor Whitaker had already opened the survey document again and was reading it for the 4th time, her finger moving along the margins, her face composed and intent and absolutely focused on whatever she was looking for. Eleanor did not sleep well that night, which was not unusual for her. She had not been a reliably good sleeper since her father died, but this particular sleeplessness had a different quality than her usual kind. Most nights when sleep didn't come, it was a diffuse thing, a general restlessness without a specific object. This night her mind had something to work on, and it worked on it with the focused, slightly feverish energy of a person who has just discovered that two separate threads of their life connect in a place they hadn't anticipated. She lay in the back room under two quilts, her and Clara's blue-patched one. The girl had produced the previous evening with the solemn efficiency of someone completing a transaction, and she stared straight at the ceiling and thought about her father. James Whittaker had been a methodical man. That was the word for him. She'd always thought not cold, not distant, but methodical in the way that certain kinds of careful people are, people for whom precision is not a professional habit but a moral one. He believed that getting things exactly right mattered, that the difference between an accurate measurement and an imprecise one was not merely technical but ethical, because other people's lives and livelihoods depended on the numbers being correct. He had passed this belief on to Eleanor so thoroughly that she sometimes caught herself applying it to things that had nothing to do with land or measurement, to conversations, to decisions, to the way she read a room. He had started writing to someone in Montana in 1889. She'd been 19 then, old enough to notice the correspondence without understanding it, young enough not to press him for details. She knew the letters went to a territorial land office, and sometimes to a man whose name appeared on the envelopes R. Aldous in Helena. She had assumed it was professional. Survey work, boundary questions, the ordinary business of a land surveyor with connections in multiple territories. After he died, she opened the locked box. She read 2 years' worth of letters, drafts of his own, and copies he'd kept of the ones sent back, and she understood that it was not ordinary business. He had found something not on his own survey work in New York, but in the records, the federal land records that were publicly available to anyone who knew what they were looking for and had the technical training to read them properly. Boundary discrepancies, duplicate claims, a pattern of frontier properties where the recorded deed and the original territorial grant did not precisely match, and where the difference, always small, always just enough to be dismissed as clerical error, consistently favored a set of purchasers who were acquiring land at deeply undervalued prices by exploiting the confusion. Consolidated Western Land Company. That name had appeared in her father's draft letters 3 times. She had written it down in her own notebook and kept the notebook. She had not told Caleb any of this yet. She'd told him the essential truth that she had known about her father's connection to Montana land fraud, that she had come in part because of it, that finding his actual handwriting in this specific house had been more than she'd prepared for. But she hadn't told him the full shape of what she believed her father had found, or what she thought it meant for Caleb's situation specifically. She hadn't told him because she needed to look at those survey documents again in the morning light, compare them to what she carried in her own memory, and be sure before she said more. She was her father's daughter. She didn't say things she wasn't sure of. Eventually she slept, lightly and briefly, and woke before dawn to the sound of Caleb moving in the kitchen, building the fire back up, and she lay still and listened to the ordinary sounds of the house waking, and thought that whatever else this place was, whatever difficulty it held, it did not feel hostile. That was more than she'd had in the last 2 years, and she had learned not to dismiss small mercies. She got up and went to help with breakfast. The survey documents were spread across the kitchen table by 7 in the morning, the children still in the loft, the fire going well, 2 mugs of coffee cooling at the edges of the papers, because there was no clear space to put them anywhere else. Eleanor had her father's bundle on one side and a piece of paper on which she'd been writing notes. Caleb sat across from her and watched her work with the patient attention of a man who understands he is watching something do something he can't do himself. This line here, she said, pointing to a notation on the second document, is a reference to the original 1,882 territorial survey of this grid section. That survey established the baseline for all the property boundaries in this area. My father's work in 1886 was a resurvey. They did that periodically to catch errors or update records when the original measurements were disputed. And he found something. He found that the eastern boundary of this section, which includes your property and the Hardin place, and at least 2 others had been recorded incorrectly in the county deed register. Not in the original territorial survey, which is accurate. In the county register, which is what people actually use when they're buying and selling. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Incorrectly how? The recorded boundaries move the line approximately 60 feet east of where the actual surveyed line sits. She looked at him. That's not a catastrophic difference. It's subtle. Subtle enough that most people would never catch it unless they were looking at both documents side by side and had the training to read them. But what it means is that the land as recorded includes a strip along the eastern edge that, according to the original territorial grant, doesn't belong to the parcels as registered. Whose does it belong to? She tapped the margin note. That's what my father was trying to determine when he filed his report. He'd identified the discrepancy and flagged it, but tracing who had actually acquired those 60-foot strips, tracking where the error originated, and who benefited from it, that's the harder work. And it requires access to records in Helena, not just the county office. And that's what the letters were. I believe so. He was corresponding with someone in Helena who had access to the territorial records, trying to build the complete picture. She sat back. He died before he could finish it. Caleb looked at the papers for a long moment. And Briggs, he said, the Consolidated Western Land Company. They're buying distressed properties in this valley. Properties where the owners are struggling, where the debt situation makes a foreclosure claim plausible. She held his gaze. If those properties have a boundary discrepancy that's never been corrected, and if the company is aware of that discrepancy, they could acquire the land and then quietly resolve the boundary issue in their favor. They'd end up with more land than what's in the recorded deed, and no one would know because the original discrepancy was never public. Caleb sat very still. You're saying they know about this already. I'm saying it's possible. The pattern of which properties they're pursuing yours, and I'd want to verify, but I believe the hardened place has had pressure too, is consistent with properties in the affected boundary zone. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had picked up again, coming down out of the north with the particular persistence of a February wind that intends to remind you of its presence for some hours. We need the Helena records, Eleanor said. I know, Caleb turned his coffee mug in his hands. I know a man in Missoula. He's done legal work before. He's not exactly a lawyer, but he knows the territorial law. He's helped ranchers with claim disputes. That's a start, Eleanor said. But the records themselves, we'd need someone with access to the territorial land office. The man in Helena, Caleb said. Your father was writing to someone there. R. Aldous. Eleanor looked up. You remember that from what I told you. I pay attention, he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. Do you know if that name means anything in this area? No, Caleb said, but I can ask. Carefully. Overhead, the loft floorboards creaked, and then the sound of Clara's feet. She had a very particular way of coming down the loft ladder, always slightly too fast, as though she'd been waiting at the top for permission, and once it was given, she didn't intend to waste time. She appeared at the bottom, hair loose and wild, looked at the papers covering the table, and looked at Eleanor and Caleb across them. What's all that? Clara asked. Maps, Eleanor said. Clara came and looked. They don't look like maps. They're the kind of maps that don't have pictures, Eleanor said. Just numbers. Clara considered this with the serious face of a child deciding whether this was interesting or not. She decided it was not currently, and went to find her boots. Thomas came down the ladder after her, more carefully, and he did look at the papers. And he looked at Eleanor, and something in his expression said he understood that whatever was on that table was not nothing, even if he didn't know what it was. He didn't ask. He went and got his coat. Eleanor started clearing the papers to make room for breakfast. The trouble with Marta Gruen's daughter Lottie was that she had a generous nature and a leaky mouth, which was a combination that made her simultaneously well-liked and the primary vector by which information traveled through Hamilton. She didn't gossip out of malice. She gossiped out of a genuine enthusiasm for the world and the people in it, an inability to hold interesting information without sharing it, and an optimistic belief that sharing information was usually beneficial. This belief was wrong approximately 40% of the time. On a Wednesday morning in mid-February, Eleanor came into the dry goods store to pick up a few items she needed and to ask about the price of lye soap in bulk, which was a practical inquiry and nothing more. Lottie was behind the counter, and Lottie, who had a naturally open face that showed everything that passed through her mind, looked at Eleanor with the particular brightness of someone who has a piece of information they've been waiting to deliver. Mrs. Kavanaugh was in yesterday, Lottie said, by way of what she considered a casual opening. Eleanor set her list on the counter. I don't think I've met her. She's married to one of the men who works for the land company. The consolidated company. She came in for thread and we got to talking. Lottie dropped her voice, though there was no one else in the store. She said Harlan Briggs was in her husband's office last week, and she said he was talking about the Whitmore place specifically. She didn't catch all of it, but she heard him say he wasn't worried about the deadline because the ranch was going to fold before it came to any real legal trouble. Eleanor looked at her steadily. He said that. That's what she said, he said. Lottie leaned forward slightly. She says, and this is the part that made her tell me, because she's not the kind of woman who talks out of turn. Generally, she said Briggs mentioned that the man in that house didn't have anyone to fight back. Those were his words. Nobody to fight back. Eleanor picked up her list from the counter and smoothed it flat. He said that before I arrived, she said, or after. Lottie blinked. I don't know. She didn't say. It matters, Eleanor said. Not harshly, just factually. Because if he said it after, then he hasn't paid much attention. She bought her items and left, and Lottie watched her go and felt, in the specific way that perceptive people sometimes feel things before they can fully articulate them, that something just shifted in the temperature of the room. There were two things Eleanor discovered in her third week on the Whitmore ranch that she had not anticipated. The first was that she was good at the cattle. She had not known this about herself because she'd had no reason to know it before. She'd grown up in a town, handled horses occasionally, but had no real experience with cattle management. What she found, working alongside Caleb in the mornings when the weather allowed, was that she understood the animals quickly, their patterns, their rhythms, which ones were temperamental and which were easy, how to read distress versus ordinary complaint. Caleb noticed this and said nothing for several days, and then one morning simply reorganized their division of labor so that Eleanor took the south pen and he took the north, and this happened without discussion and without ceremony, which was exactly the kind of acknowledgement she preferred. The second thing was Thomas. She'd been watching him, not obtrusively, but with the attention she gave everything. He was a quiet boy with a lot happening inside him, the kind of child who seems self-contained until you realize that the self-containment is a lid, not an absence, and that under it things were moving fast and had been for a long time. He had taken his mother's death in the way that some children take grief, not by falling apart, but by going very still, by getting careful, by doing the 9-year-old equivalent of not wanting to need anything from anyone, because needing things had not worked out well recently. He didn't trust her. She understood this, and she did not try to maneuver around it or accelerate it. She just made herself consistent and predictable and waited. What happened, which she had not planned, was the arithmetic. She had found his school materials one afternoon when she was straightening the main room, a McGuffey reader, badly worn, and a slate with his lessons on it. She'd glanced at the slate, not intending to look, and had seen a problem he'd been working on that was set up incorrectly, kind of error that comes not from not understanding arithmetic, but from misreading the question and then solving the wrong problem with complete internal consistency. She had left a note next to the slate, not correcting it, exactly just a single line. The question is asking for the total, not the remainder. Work it again from the start. She'd come back an hour later to find him sitting at the table with the slate, and he'd worked it correctly. And when he heard her come in, he looked up with the particular expression of a child who has been helped and isn't sure how he feels about accepting the help from this particular person. "You saw what I did wrong," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "You solved the right problem. It was just a different problem than the one they asked." He thought about this. That's the same as being wrong. Technically, she agreed. But it's a useful kind of wrong, because it tells you you can do the arithmetic. You just need to slow down on the reading. He looked at the slate. "Teacher said I rush." "Your teacher's right." "You were a teacher?" "No," Eleanor said. "My father just made me read everything twice before I answered." Thomas looked at her a longer look than he'd given her before, more direct, as though he was deciding something. "Did it help?" he asked. "Eventually," she said. "It was annoying at first." He almost smiled. "Yeah," he said, almost to himself. She didn't push it. She went back to what she'd been doing, and he went back to his slate, and that was all. But something had opened, just slightly, the way a window opens that's been painted shut, not all the way, and with effort, and not without resistance, but open. Harlan Briggs came back on a Thursday afternoon at the end of February, and this time he had 3 riders with him instead of 2, which was either a show of force or a genuine belief that it might be necessary. He didn't ride to the door. He stopped at the gate to the main yard and waited there, which was a different tactic, less aggressive on its but more calculated, the kind of positioning that says, I'm giving you the chance to come to me, which puts you in the position of the person who walks toward trouble rather than the one who brings it. Caleb saw them from the barn and came out slowly, not hurrying. Eleanor was in the house and had seen them from the window before Caleb came out of the barn, and she was already at the door by the time he crossed the yard toward the gate. She didn't follow him out. She stood in the doorway and watched. Briggs looked at her standing there and looked back at Caleb. You've got help now, he said. It wasn't a question, and the way he said it landed somewhere between observation and dismissal, the tone of a man who has assessed the addition of a woman to the property and found it untroubling. I have a wife, Caleb said. He'd said it the same flat way he said most things. Eleanor heard the word and didn't react to it, because there were larger things happening. Right, Briggs said, the mail order situation. He said it without heat, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with contempt. Just a fact he was noting, the way you note weather. I came out to give you fair notice, Whitmore. The company has filed an intent of claim with the county recorder. That starts the formal clock. You've got until March 1st to satisfy the debt or surrender the property. I know the date, Caleb said. I want to make sure we're clear on the terms, Briggs said, because sometimes people convince themselves they have more time or more options than they actually have, and then it gets unpleasant. He looked briefly at the house, at Eleanor in the doorway. I'd hate for this to get unpleasant. It won't, Caleb said. Not from my end. Briggs held his gaze for a moment. He was a man in his late 40s, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered into an expression of permanent mild patience that was probably more threatening than open hostility would have been. He had the look of a man who had waited out many people and expected to wait out many more. March 1st, he said again. Then he turned his horse and the riders fell in and they rode back down the lane. Caleb stood at the gate for a moment after they'd gone, not moving. Eleanor came out of the doorway and crossed the yard and stood beside him. He doesn't know about the documents, she said quietly. Caleb agreed. He thinks this is already over. He's done this before, Caleb said. He knows the pattern. Struggling family, debt, no options. Let it run to the deadline. He's done it enough times that he doesn't expect surprises. Eleanor looked down the lane where the riders had gone. He's going to get one, she said. Caleb looked at her sidelong. What are you planning? I need 2 weeks, she said. And I need a letter sent to Missoula. To my man there? Start. And I need to write to Helena, the Territorial Land Office directly, on a question of surveying records. She paused. It would help if the letter came from you. Why? Because a letter from a property owner requesting clarification of survey records is routine, she said. A letter from a woman who arrived last month asking about territorial land fraud records is not. She looked at him. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. What exactly do you need them to send? The original 1,882 survey records for this grid section. The baseline documents. If the county deed register shows what I think it shows, the discrepancy will be visible by direct comparison. And if it is, then we have something, Eleanor said. Not everything, but something to stand on. He was quiet for a moment. 2 weeks is cutting close to the first. I know, she said. Write the letter tonight. I'll tell you what to say. She turned and went back into the house, and Caleb stood a moment longer in the cold yard and thought about the particular strangeness of his life, which had in the space of 3 weeks become considerably more complicated than he'd anticipated, and also, in some way he hadn't expected, less lonely. He went inside. Clara got sick in the first week of March. Not dangerously a chest cold that produced a worrying cough and a fever that rose and fell with the casual unpredictability of a 6-year-old's immune system defending itself noisily but effectively. She was miserable, which she communicated clearly and with some volume, and she was clingy in the specific way of sick children who have learned that someone reliable will come when they call. Called for Eleanor. Not consistently, she called for her father, too, and there were moments when she asked for her mother with the heartbreaking absent-mindedness of a child whose grief had not yet fully accepted its own permanence. But Eleanor's name came up in a rotation that included Caleb's, and Eleanor responded each time without making a thing of it, sitting with Clara in the loft while the girl dozed, bringing water and willow bark tea, reading to her from the McGuffey reader in a low voice when Clara couldn't sleep. Caleb heard them from below one night, Clara's voice asking for the same passage again, the one about the 2 brothers, and Eleanor reading it again without any sign of impatience, her voice steady and even in the dark of the loft. He sat at the table below and did not move for a while and listened to that sound, and felt something complicated and not entirely comfortable move through him, which he did not examine too closely. Thomas, who had been watching all of this with his particular careful attention, came and sat across from his father one evening, while Eleanor was upstairs with Clara, and said without preamble, "She's not what you expected." Caleb looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "When you told us she was coming, you were scared," Thomas said. "You didn't say you were, but I could tell." He considered. "You're not scared of her now." Caleb thought about that. "No," he said, "I'm not. Is she going to stay?" "That's the plan," Caleb said. "Yes." Thomas looked at the table. "Clara likes her some." "I know. She reads the same thing twice when Clara asks. She doesn't get annoyed." Thomas said as though it was a specific and significant data point, which it was. May had been loving and capable, and not always patient with the second-time requests, which was human and understandable. But it meant that Thomas had a detailed inner accounting of what each person's patience limit looked like, and when it arrived. "Eleanor's patient," Caleb agreed. "Is that why you picked her?" Caleb looked at his son, this 9-year-old who had been too old for his age since his mother died, who asked questions like a much older person, and then waited for answers with the stillness of someone who genuinely wanted the truth, and not the comfortable version of it. "I didn't know that about her when I picked her," Caleb said honestly. "I didn't know very much. I just knew we needed help, and she seemed like someone who could give it. And now." Caleb thought about Eleanor at the table with the survey documents, about her voice in the cold dark asking, he said, that before I arrived or after, about the way she'd stood in the barn doorway the first time and simply assessed the cattle without performing any reaction to them. "Now I know a lot more," he said, "and most of it's better than I expected." Thomas nodded slowly and then went back to his reading, and Caleb watched him go and thought that the boy had his mother's way of asking the question that sat under all the other questions and getting to it without warning. The letter from Missoula came back in 10 days, which was faster than Caleb had hoped. Contact there a man named Boyd Marsh, who had spent 20 years navigating territorial legal questions with a particular expertise in property claims, wrote back in his characteristic style, which was to say dense, practical, and without any wasted words. He confirmed what Eleanor had suspected. The Consolidated Western Land Company had been active in 3 valleys over the past 4 years, always following the same pattern, always targeting properties in financial distress, and always, Boyd wrote, there was something hinky about the way their claims ended up more land than what the original deed described. He'd heard this from 2 separate ranchers who'd tried to fight and hadn't known how. He hadn't been able to prove the mechanism until now. "If your wife has the survey documents she says she has," Boyd wrote, "that might be the mechanism. I want to see them. Don't let anyone else see them first." Eleanor read this letter twice and then folded it and put it in the wooden box with the survey papers. "He says wife," she observed. "I told him I'd gotten married," Caleb said. It was simpler. She looked at him. He didn't look away. There was a beat of something not awkward, exactly, but aware. They were, by practical arrangement and necessity, married in the terms of the agreement that had brought her here. She'd arrived. She was staying. The paperwork would follow in due time. But the actual ceremony hadn't happened. They both knew that. The word wife in Boyd Marsh's letter was aspirationally accurate at best. "We should do it properly," Eleanor said. "The legal part. Before any of this comes to a head." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "For legal standing," he said. "Yes," she said, "and because it's right. If I'm going to stand up in front of this valley and present evidence, I should be what I say I am." "I'll speak to the judge," Caleb said. "He comes through Hamilton twice a month." "Good," Eleanor said. She went back to her notes. The judge came through on the 19th of February, which was 11 days before the land company's deadline, and Caleb Whitmore and Eleanor Whitaker were married in the county recorder's office, with Thomas and Clara as witnesses, and the judge's clerk as the second witness required by law. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Clara wore her good dress and had braided her own hair, which Eleanor had shown her how to do 3 days prior. Thomas wore his school clothes and stood very straight and did not fidget, though he wanted to. When it was done, Eleanor signed her name in the record book, Eleanor Whitmore, and looked at the signature for a moment, the way a person looks at something new that will take getting used to. Then she capped the pen and handed it back to the clerk and thanked the judge, who was a spare man in his 60s named Aldridge, who had performed several hundred of these and could tell, in the way of long experience, the ones that were going to hold and the ones that weren't. He looked at Caleb and Eleanor and thought it was likely to hold, for reasons he couldn't have precisely articulated, but that had to do with the particular quality of how they stood near each other, not romantic. Not demonstrative, but oriented, the way two people are who have already begun to rely on each other in real ways before the ceremony made it official. They rode home in the wagon in the late afternoon. Clara fell asleep leaning against Eleanor's side. Thomas, next to his father, looked out at the valley, and after a while he said quietly, "Is it different now?" "A little," Caleb said. "The important parts are the same." Thomas thought about this and seemed to find it satisfactory. He went back to watching the valley. Eleanor felt Clara's weight against her side and looked at the mountains going dark at their peaks as the light changed, and thought about her father and about how the things we carry with us have a way of finding their destination even when we don't know where we're going. The wagon rolled on toward home, and behind them, the town of Hamilton shrank to a cluster of lights, and the land company's deadline was 11 days away. And in the wooden box on the Whitmore kitchen shelf sat a bundle of papers tied with string that nobody outside that house yet understood the importance of, and Eleanor Whitmore looked at the mountains and thought, not yet, but soon. Cold had settled in deep for the night, and the horse moved steadily, and Clara breathed slow, and even against Eleanor's side, and the road home was dark but not unfamiliar. The letter from the Territorial Land Office in Helena arrived on the 24th of February, which was 5 days before the deadline, and Eleanor was the one who saw it first, because she was the one who had been watching for it. She had developed a habit over the preceding days of finding reasons to be near the front of the property in the late morning, when the postrider came through. She didn't make a production of it. She was always doing something else, checking the fence line, hauling wood, walking the south pasture edge to assess the snow compaction. She positioned herself so she could see the lane, and on the morning of the 24th she saw the rider turn in, and she set down what she was carrying and walked to meet him. The envelope was from the Helena office of the Territorial Land Registry. It was addressed to Caleb Whitmore. She signed for it and carried it to the house and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment without opening it, which was harder than it sounds. Caleb came in from the barn 20 minutes later and saw the envelope on the table and saw Eleanor standing near the window with her arms crossed, which was a posture he had already learned meant she was thinking hard about something and keeping the thinking contained. "Helena," he said. "Yes." He picked it up. He looked at her. "You want to open it?" "Very much," she said. He handed it to her. She took it, and she didn't rush. She opened it the way she did most things, with a care that wasn't fussiness but precision, and she unfolded the 2 sheets inside and read them. And Caleb watched her face, and he had learned enough about her face in 5 weeks to know that what it was doing now was controlled relief, the expression of someone whose working theory has just been confirmed, but who isn't going to celebrate until they've read every word. She read to the bottom of the 2nd sheet, then she read it again. Then she set it on the table and put her hand flat on it and looked at him. "It's there," she said. They sent the baseline survey record for the 1,882 grid survey of this section. The boundary line is recorded exactly where my father's documents put it, 61 feet west of the county deed register. 61, Caleb said. He rounded to 60 in his notes, Eleanor said. He was precise, but he was writing quickly. The official record is 61 feet. She looked at the letter. Which means the deed registered in this county for your property, and the Hardin place and the Collier spread on the south end all describe land that extends 61 feet further east than the actual territorial grant allows. Caleb sat down slowly at the table in the company. If they acquire this property under the current deed, they acquire it with that discrepancy baked in. Then they go to Helena and file a correction they'd claim they discovered it, that they're rectifying a clerical error, and the corrected boundary gives them the original grant land, plus allows them to pick up the adjacent strip separately, at whatever price they want, because the strip is now technically unclaimed territory. She sat down across from him. Clean. It would have worked. No one in this valley knew to look for it. Except your father, Caleb said. Except my father, she said. And now us. They sat with that for a moment. The fire was going steadily, and the house smelled of the oat porridge. Eleanor had made that morning, and upstairs Clara was talking to herself in the low, elaborate way she did when she was constructing some private game or narrative, and the sound of it was very ordinary and domestic against the thing that was sitting between the two adults at the kitchen table. 5 days, Caleb said. Yes. Is it enough? Eleanor thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. Might be, she said. It depends on who we can get to look at this before March 1st, and whether they're willing to act on what they see. If we can get Boyd Marsh here from Missoula with his documentation, and if we can show this to the county recorder, and if the recorder is not in the company's pocket, he's not, Caleb said. Walt Greer has been the county recorder for 15 years, and he's an irritable old man who doesn't like being told what to do by anyone. He's not corrupt. He's just difficult. Difficult I can work with, Eleanor said. Corrupt I cannot. She picked up the Helena letter and folded it back carefully along its original creases. I need to write to Boyd Marsh today, and we need to talk to the Hardins. Caleb looked at her. Frank Hardin and I haven't spoken well in 2 years, he said. We had a dispute about the creek. Nothing was resolved. Do you think he's being pressured by the company too? I think the fact that his son came by last month and asked about whether we'd had any unusual visitors is a reasonable indicator, Caleb said. We didn't make anything of it at the time. Talk to him, Eleanor said. Today if you can. He doesn't need to be your friend to have a shared interest. She paused. And the Colliers. Margaret Collier is a widow. Her son runs the place now. 22 is not the most. He doesn't think fast on his feet, but he's honest, and he does what's right. Someone lays it out clearly. Then we lay it out clearly, Eleanor said. She stood up. I'll write the letter to Boyd. You ride to Hardin's. Caleb looked at her at the way she was already moving, the way her mind was already 3 steps ahead, organizing, sequencing. He thought about the night she'd arrived on the platform, how he'd had that first uncharitable thought about her not being what he'd expected, and he thought about what a poor judge of a person's actual nature a first impression was. Eleanor, he said. She turned. You know this might not work, he said. Not pessimistically, just squarely, the way he approached most difficult things, even with the documents. These companies have money and lawyers, and they know how to delay. Marsh can't promise us anything, I know, she said. And if it doesn't work, I know, she said again. But it has a chance, and before I came here it had none. She held his gaze for a moment. Not nothing, Caleb. He didn't argue. He got his coat. Frank Hardin was a big man, slow-moving and deliberate with the weathered patience of someone who'd been farming hard land for 30 years and had developed a philosophical relationship with difficulty. He and Caleb had not parted well over the creek dispute. There'd been a winter 2 years ago when the Hardin irrigation trench had backed up and sent water over the boundary line and taken out part of Caleb's south fence, and the conversation about responsibility for the repairs had gotten heated in the way of men who were both under too much pressure and not good at talking about it. They had not formally resolved anything. They had simply stopped pressing the wound and let it scar over. When Caleb rode up to the Hardin place, Frank came out onto the porch and watched him come with the careful neutrality of a man who has not decided yet whether a visitor is welcome. Whitmore, he said. Frank. Caleb stopped his horse. I'm not here about the creek. All right, Frank said. Not good or come in. Just acknowledgement, which was about what Caleb had expected. I need to ask you something directly, Caleb said. Has the Consolidated Western Land Company made a move on your property? Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped off the porch and came to stand near Caleb's horse, which was the closest thing to an invitation he seemed inclined to offer. Briggs was here in January, he said quietly. Said I owed on a note. I told him the note wasn't due until April. What did he say? Said there'd been a change in terms. Said it was in the original agreement. Frank looked at him steadily. Pulled the agreement out. There was no such clause. He said I was misreading it. Were you? No, Frank said flatly. I can read. Caleb nodded. I want you to come to a meeting, he said. My place, day after tomorrow. Bring whatever documents you have on your property deed, the original claim, anything from the county recorder's office. Frank looked at him for a long moment. What kind of meeting? The kind that might give us a way to fight this, Caleb said. My wife has found something in the survey records. Something that might explain what the company is actually doing and why. Frank's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough. Your wife, he said. The woman from back east. Yes, Caleb said. People in town are saying she's... He stopped. They're saying she's smart but peculiar. She's both, Caleb said. Come to the meeting, Frank. Frank looked at him for another moment and then looked at the land around him. His land, the land his family had worked for a decade, the land that a company in a city somewhere had decided it could take because the man standing on it was too small to stop them. Something moved across his face that Caleb recognized, because he'd felt it himself, the moment when a person who has been absorbing blows decides they're done absorbing. Day after tomorrow, Frank said. What time? Eleanor wrote 3 letters that afternoon. One to Boyd Marsh in Missoula, laying out the situation in full and asking him to come. If at all possible, she did not say please. She said, "This is the evidence you've been waiting for." And the window is 5 days 1 to Walt Greer, the county recorder, formally requesting a review of the boundary records for the affected section and citing the Helena letter, and 1 to a woman named Agnes Collier, Margaret Collier's sister-in-law, who Eleanor had met once at the dry goods store, and who had the specific quality of someone who got things done. She also did 3 other things that afternoon that she didn't tell Caleb about, not because she was keeping secrets, but because he was occupied with the Hardin visit, and she worked better without narrating her process. She made a complete copy of her father's survey annotations, in her own hand on fresh paper. The originals were irreplaceable. She needed a set she could show without risking the bundle. She worked with the particular focus of someone doing something that mattered, her handwriting careful and exact, replicating not just the words but the layout of the notes as her father had arranged them, because she knew from watching him that the spatial relationship of annotations to the survey lines they referenced was itself part of the information. She numbered each page. Then she wrapped the originals in oilskin from the supply room and put them back in the wooden box, and put the box in a specific place she chose deliberately, not obvious, not hidden so well it would be inaccessible in an emergency, but in a location that she noted and that she intended to show Caleb tonight. The third thing she did was walk the east boundary of the property. She'd been meaning to do it since she arrived and hadn't found the time. She did it now, in the thin late afternoon light, walking the fence line from the south corner to the north corner and counting her paces and looking at the terrain and matching it against what she'd read in the survey documents. The boundary was where she expected it to be, confirmed by the line of old fence posts that Caleb had told her predated his ownership of the land, put in by the original homesteader in the mid-1870s. The fence had been repaired many times, sections replaced, but the post holes of the originals were still visible under the newer work, and those post holes matched the surveyed line exactly. She stood at the north corner and looked east. The land that lay beyond the fence, the 61-foot strip that ran the full north-south length of the property, was mostly scrub and rock, not particularly valuable in itself. But the strip connected, at the north end, to a section that had water access, a seasonal creek that came down from the Hardin Ridge and crossed both properties. Whoever owned that strip controlled the most direct approach to that water from the east. She understood it now completely. The strip wasn't about the acreage. It was about the water approach. In a territory where water rights were the difference between a viable ranch and a dead one, controlling that access point was worth considerably more than 61 feet of scrubby land. She walked back to the house in the early dark and met Caleb coming in from the barn and told him about the water access, and she watched his face as he understood it. She saw the moment it landed not just as an abstract legal question, but as something personal, as the explanation for why this particular valley, these particular properties, were the ones the company had targeted. May fought to keep those creek rights, he said quietly. She's the one who negotiated the informal agreement with the Hardins. She understood the water situation better than I did at the time. He looked at Eleanor. She would have seen this. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I think your father-in-law saw it first," she said. "He was the one who brought the survey papers to her. He surveyed this area before my father did. He may have noticed the discrepancy independently and not known what to do with it." Caleb was still. "So May's father and your father both found the same problem." "From different directions," Eleanor said. "Yes, and neither of them was able to do anything about it." He looked at her directly, and with a feeling he didn't try to name. "And now their children are sitting in the middle of it." "Yes," she said simply. They ate supper and put the children to bed, and then they sat at the table with the copied documents spread between them and worked by lamplight, building the sequence of the argument they would have to make, organizing the evidence in the order that would be most comprehensible to people who hadn't spent weeks thinking about this the way Eleanor had. Caleb was better at this part than she'd expected. He thought in structures, in sequences, in the kind of logical if-then chains that made for clear arguments, and when she explained something, he asked the question that would also be asked by the person they needed to convince, which was exactly what she needed. They worked for 3 hours. They didn't always agree about the order. They argued twice briefly about how much technical detail to include versus how much to strip out for clarity, and both times they reached a compromise that was better than either of their original positions. At some point, Eleanor realized they had been talking for 3 hours, without the conversation costing her anything, which was not nothing. She had spent 2 years in her cousin's house, being politely tolerated, and occasionally made to feel like a burden, and before that she had spent years being the daughter who was capable but not fashionable, capable but not married, capable but somehow slightly inconvenient to the social order. Sitting across this table, in this kitchen, making arguments that this man listened to and pushed back on and incorporated, it was a kind of respect she had not had in a long time. She did not say any of this, but she thought it. Boyd Marsh arrived the next morning, a day earlier than even Eleanor had hoped, which meant he'd left Missoula within hours of receiving her letter. He was a wiry man in his early 60s with a gray mustache and the slightly compressed energy of someone who has spent decades doing things that matter under time pressure. He tied his horse at the gate and came up to the house and shook Eleanor's hand before Caleb's, which she noticed and appreciated without remarking on. He read the documents at the kitchen table while Eleanor and Caleb sat across from him, and the children were sent outside Clara with reluctance. Thomas with the specific look of someone who understands he's being excluded from something important and is filing the information for later processing. Boyd Marsh read slowly. He asked no questions while he read. He made 3 notes on a small pad he carried. When he was done, he sat back and looked at Eleanor. "Your father," he said. "James Whittaker." "Yes, I corresponded with R. Aldous in the Helena office about a land surveyor named Whittaker who had filed a discrepancy report in 87. I never made the connection that he was." He paused, trying to get someone in Helena to act on it. Aldous passed it up the chain. It got buried. "Deliberately?" Eleanor asked. "I don't know," Boyd said honestly. Could have been bureaucratic inertia. Could have been deliberate. The company had friends in the territorial administration at that time. Still might. He tapped the papers. "But this the original survey baseline from Helena, combined with your father's margin annotations, and the county deed register discrepancy. This is the mechanism laid out step by step. This is what I've been trying to find for 2 years. Can you use it?" Caleb asked. "In court, eventually, yes," Boyd said. "But not by March 1st. Not in 5 days. A lawsuit takes months. And even with this evidence, the company will file for delay, bring in their own surveyors, challenge the Helena records. They'll fight it." Eleanor had expected this. "What can we do by March 1st?" she said. It wasn't a question exactly, more of a request to think out loud together. Boyd looked at her. "The county recorder can issue a hold on any property transfer if there's an active dispute about the deed accuracy. Walt Greer can do that. He has the authority. If we can get him to look at these documents and agree there's a legitimate question about the boundary record, he can freeze the company's claim until the question is formally resolved." "Caleb says he's difficult," Eleanor said. "He's an obstinate old goat," Boyd agreed. "But he hates being taken for a fool, and he hates the idea of the county records being used fraudulently even more. If you lay this out for him correctly, he'll see it. The question is getting him to see it before March 1st. He looked at Caleb. "Can you get him out here?" "I can try," Caleb said. "He doesn't come out of town easily." "Then we go to him," Eleanor said. "Tomorrow, with the documents." Boyd looked at her. "You want to go to the county recorder's office? With you? With Caleb? With the Hardins, if Frank is willing, and with my copies of these documents?" She met his eyes. "And I want to present it myself." There was a brief pause. Boyd looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Eleanor. "You know Greer will be Boyd started." Resistant to hearing it from a woman, Eleanor finished. "Yes, I know, do it anyway. Because if Caleb presents it and gets a question he can't answer, we lose the thread. I'm the one who understands this completely. I'm the one who can answer whatever Greer asks." She paused. "You can speak first, establish the legal context. Then let me explain the evidence." Boyd looked at her for another moment, and then slowly nodded. "All right," he said. "That's how we do it." The meeting with Walt Greer happened the following morning, a Thursday, with 2 days left before the deadline. It took place in the county recorder's office, which was a small, paper-crammed room behind the main courthouse in Hamilton, smelling of ink and old files, and the particular dust of official records that have not been disturbed recently. Greer was in his mid-70s, a thin man with a rigid posture that had probably been military at some earlier point and had never fully relaxed since, with eyes that looked at everything with the flat, assessing attention of someone who had been lied to professionally for 50 years and had developed finely calibrated detectors. He looked at the party that came through his door. Boyd Marsh he knew, Caleb Whitmore he knew by name if not well, and Eleanor he looked at with the careful, non-committal gaze of a man reserving judgment, and he pointed at the chairs and table in the corner and said, "You have 1 hour." After that, I have other business. They had prepared for this. Boyd opened. Establishing the legal framework, the question of boundary discrepancy, the authority of the original territorial grant over subsequent county deed registrations, the mechanism by which an uncorrected error in a deed could be exploited by a purchaser with prior knowledge. He was precise and he was efficient, and Greer listened without expression and asked two sharp questions that Boyd answered directly. Then Eleanor put the documents on the table. She didn't start with the dramatic pieces. She started with the Helena letter, the most recent and most official document, and she laid it beside the county deed register copy she'd obtained from Greer's own office file 2 days prior, and she showed the discrepancy in the most simple and direct way possible. 2 lines, 2 numbers, 61 feet of difference. She explained her father's survey work in 1886, his methodology, his notation system, and then she showed the annotations, and she showed how they corresponded precisely to what the Helena document now confirmed. Greer looked at the documents. He picked up the Helena letter and read it fully. He picked up her father's annotations and read them. He looked at Eleanor. "Your father made these notes," he said. "Yes, sir. He was a licensed surveyor." "Yes, sir." "Licensed in New York State, with contracted work in 3 territories, including Montana. And you're telling me the Consolidated Western Land Company is targeting properties in this boundary zone because they intend to exploit this discrepancy after acquisition." "I'm telling you the evidence is consistent with that conclusion," Eleanor said carefully. "I'm not telling you I can prove their intent. I can prove the discrepancy exists and that the company is actively pursuing properties within the affected zone." Greer looked at her for a long moment. "You've been here how long?" 5 weeks, she said. "And you found all this in 5 weeks." "I found the survey documents in the first week," she said. "They were already here. My father's work was already done." Just understood what it said. Something shifted in Greer's expression, not warmth. He didn't seem to do warmth, but something that might have been a recalibration. He looked at Caleb. "You knew about these documents." "I had them," Caleb said. "I didn't know what they meant until Eleanor read them." Greer looked at the papers again. He was quiet for a long time. Boyd Marsh, to his credit, did not fill the silence. "I can issue a hold on the Whitmore property transfer," Greer said finally, "on the grounds of an active deed accuracy dispute. That freezes Briggs's claim through the resolution period." "The Hardin property as well," Eleanor said, and the Collier spread. Greer looked at her sharply. "That's 3 holds. The same discrepancy affects all 3, she said. "The same company is pursuing all 3. If you hold one and not the others, they'll accelerate the other 2 before the legal question is resolved." Greer was quiet again. "You've thought about this," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something more like reluctant acknowledgement. "Yes, sir," she said. "I have." He picked up the Helena letter one more time, held it for a moment, set it down. "Leave copies of everything with my office," he said. "I'll issue the 3 holds today, pending formal dispute resolution. That gives you time to get this into the territorial court system through proper channels." He looked at Boyd. "You're handling the legal filing?" "I am," Boyd said. "File within 30 days or the holds expire," Greer said. He looked at Eleanor once more, the same flat, assessing look, and this time it had something additional in it, though he wasn't going to call it admiration. He was a man who respected thoroughness, and he had just been presented with something very thorough. "Is there anything else?" he asked. "Not today," Eleanor said. He nodded once and picked up his pen and began to write. They were on the street outside the courthouse when Frank Hardin, who had been waiting on the board sidewalk because Greer had only wanted the principals in the room, looked at Eleanor and said, "Did it work?" "He's issuing holds on all 3 properties," she said. Frank was quiet for a moment. He had the face of a man trying to process relief that he hasn't allowed himself to feel in several months, because allowing it would have required believing it was possible. 3, he said. 3, she confirmed. The Collier place too. Frank looked at Caleb. "Your wife," he said. "Yes," Caleb said. Frank nodded slowly, with the careful gravity of a man who doesn't say more than he means. "I owe you an apology," he said, "about the creek." "About 2 years ago," Caleb looked at him. "So do I," he said. They shook hands. And it was not a dramatic moment, and it was not resolved. All the way 2 years of bad feeling doesn't disappear in a handshake. And they both knew it, but it was a beginning. And in the cold street outside the courthouse in Hamilton, Montana, with Boyd Marsh making notes and Eleanor standing in her old good coat with the wind pulling at her hat, beginning was what they had. Harlan Briggs came to the Whitmore property that afternoon. He came alone this time, which was either a choice or an instruction, hard to know which, and he didn't stop at the gate. He came all the way to the door and knocked, which he had never done before. Caleb answered. Eleanor stood 3 feet behind him. Briggs looked at both of them. His face had the particular stillness of a man who has received information and has not yet decided how to respond to it. Greer issued holds, he said, on 3 properties. I know, Caleb said. On what grounds? Deed accuracy dispute, Caleb said. Pending formal review of the boundary records. Briggs was quiet for a moment. He looked at Eleanor. Not with hostility, with something more careful than that. The look of a man reassessing an opponent he hadn't taken seriously. This came from you, he said. Eleanor met his gaze. Came from my father's work, she said. He found the discrepancy 8 years ago. I found his documents when I arrived here. Your father, Briggs said. James Whitaker. He filed a discrepancy report with the Helena Land Office in 1887. It was set aside. He died before he could press it further. She paused. I didn't. Briggs looked at her for another moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Calculation, reassessment, the specific cognitive work of a man who has built a careful plan and is now understanding that the plan has a hole in it that he didn't know was there. This is going to take time to resolve, he said legally. These things always do. I know, Eleanor, says Ed. We have time. It was a simple sentence. It was also, in context, the most complete reversal of the power dynamic that had existed every time Harlan Briggs had ridden onto this property, because until today, time was the one thing the Consolidated Western Land Company had, and the Whitmore Ranch had not. The deadline had been the weapon. Greer's holds had taken the weapon away. Briggs understood this. He was not a stupid man. He stood on the doorstep of the house he had come here, expecting to own by the 1st of March, and he looked at the woman who had arrived 5 weeks ago with a suitcase and a dead man's papers, and he understood that something had changed in a way that his company's lawyers would need months to evaluate. We'll see how the court resolves it, he said. His voice was even, professional. He was already moving to the next calculation. Yes, Eleanor said. We will, he left. They watched him ride back down the lane, and Eleanor stood in the doorway after the gate closed behind him and felt the cold air on her face and breathed it in slowly. Deliberately, the way she had learned to do when something large had just happened, and her body needed a moment to believe it. Caleb put his hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. But then Clara's voice came from behind them both, sharp and aggrieved. You let all the cold in, she said, and supper's going to get cold, too. Eleanor looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Eleanor. And then in the doorframe of the house that still stood, on the land that still had time, with the holds in place and the documents copied and numbered and safe, they both laughed, which was the first time Eleanor had heard Caleb laugh, and the sound of it was better than she'd expected, rough and real and entirely without performance. She's right, Eleanor said, and turned back inside. The holds bought them time, but time in a legal dispute is not the same thing as safety, and Eleanor understood this better than she let on to Caleb in the days immediately following Greer's decision. She understood it because she had read her father's letters carefully enough to know that the Consolidated Western Land Company had survived challenges before, not by winning arguments quickly, but by outlasting the people making them. A ranching family with limited resources and a March deadline could be stopped by a county recorder's hold. The same family, facing 6 months of legal process, with no income from a property they couldn't fully work because the uncertainty was hanging over every decision, facing legal fees they couldn't afford, and a company with lawyers on retainer who would file every available delay that was a different kind of pressure, slower and more grinding, and it had worked before. She knew this. She did not say it at supper, or in the evenings when Caleb was already carrying enough. But she thought about it in the early mornings when she was up before everyone else, sitting with her coffee and her father's copied documents, working through the shape of what still needed to happen. Boyd Marsh had gone back to Missoula to begin the formal filing. He'd been clear with them. The filing would establish the legal dispute, which protected the holds, but the actual resolution, the territorial court review of the boundary records, and what it meant for the company's claims could take 6 months minimum, more likely a year. During that time, the company could apply pressure in other ways. They could call in other debts. They could work through intermediaries. They could make the legal process expensive enough that a family without resources would eventually have to settle just to stop bleeding. Eleanor had $47 in her own money, which she had not mentioned to Caleb because it was not yet relevant and because she had a habit of not mentioning things until they were relevant. She had brought it from Millhaven, saved from 2 years of housekeeping for her cousin's family at wages that were more courtesy than fair compensation. $47 was not enough to fund a prolonged legal fight, but it was enough to do a specific thing she had in mind. And in the first week of March, 5 days after the holds were issued, she did it. She wrote a letter to a newspaper. Not the Hamilton Weekly, which was a 4-page sheet that covered livestock prices and local appointments, and was read primarily by the people who were already in the room. She wrote to the Missoula paper, which had a circulation of 4,000, and she wrote to the Helena Independent, which was the closest thing the territory had to a paper of record. She wrote carefully and specifically, describing the boundary discrepancy, the company's pattern of acquisitions, the survey history, and the county recorder's decision to issue holds. She signed her name to both letters. Eleanor Whitmore, formerly Eleanor Whitaker, daughter of James Whitaker, licensed land surveyor. She did not tell Caleb she was doing this until the letters were written. Then she told him. He read them both, sitting at the table, while she stood near the window. He read them the way he did most important things fully, without rushing, without his face giving away much. When he was done, he set them on the table and looked up. "This will make Briggs move faster," he said. "If this gets into the papers, he'll know the legal route is going to be harder. He might try something else, I know," Eleanor said. "Something else might not be pleasant." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "But right now the only people who know what we found are us, Boyd Marsh, Walt Greer, and Harlan Briggs. Greer can hold his position. Boyd is solid. But the holds are only as good as the political will behind them. And if the company has friends in the territorial administration, which my father believed they did, then a quiet legal process that happens in offices in Helena is easier to interfere with than something that's already in the public record." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He turned one of the letters over in his hands. "You're making it harder for them to make this disappear." "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what I'm doing." He looked at her. She could see him working through the calculation, the same way she had weighing the risk of escalation against the risk of being slowly ground down in a process that was designed to favor the people who could afford to wait it out. He was not a man who came to conclusions quickly, but when he did, he came to them fully. "Send them," he said. He pushed the letters back across the table to her. "Pick them up." "There's one more thing," she said. "The community meeting." He had not heard this idea before. She watched his face adjust. "I want to bring the valley together," she said. "Not just the 3 affected properties, everyone. The Meekses, the Garfield family on the North Ridge, the people in town who have businesses that depend on these ranches staying viable. I want to lay out what the company is doing in front of all of them, with the documents, so that even if the legal process is slow, the people in this valley understand what's happening and why it matters to all of them." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You want to do this publicly?" "Company has been doing this quietly," Eleanor said. "Quietly individually, one family at a time. That's how it works. You don't know your neighbor is being squeezed, because you're both too embarrassed to say so, and they count on that. Count on isolation." She paused. "We take that away." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if he was going to push back on this one. Caleb was not a man who naturally reached for public action. He was private in the way of many people who lived at a distance from their neighbors, comfortable with his own counsel, not inclined to stage things. She knew this about him. "When?" he asked. 2 weeks, she said. "Saturday, so people can travel. Here if you're willing. Or the Grange Hall in town if you'd rather." "Here," he said after a moment. "If it's here, it's real. If it's in the Grange Hall, it's a meeting. There's a difference." Eleanor looked at him. "Yes," she said. "There is." Thomas found out about the plan not through being told, but through the specific talent of a 9-year-old boy for existing in doorways at precisely the right moment. Came to Eleanor the following morning while Caleb was in the barn and said, without preamble, "Are people coming to the house?" In 2 weeks, she said yes. "A lot of people?" "I hope so. 20, maybe 30. He thought about this. Dad doesn't like a lot of people in the house." "I know." He agreed to it. Thomas processed this. "It must be important." "It is," she said. He was quiet for a moment, standing in the way he stood when he was working up to something. "Can I help?" he said finally. "With something. I'm not saying I should be in the meeting. I just want to do something." Eleanor looked at him. He was trying very hard to look like the question was casual, and he was not quite pulling it off, and the effort of it was one of the most straightforwardly touching things she had seen in some time. "Can you write neatly?" she asked. "Yes," he said immediately. I need copies of 2 documents, written out clearly enough that people can read them easily. My handwriting is fine for records, but it runs small. Yours bigger, he said. My teacher says it's too big. It's not too big for this, Eleanor said. I'll show you what needs to be copied and explain what it means so you understand what you're writing. That way if someone asks you a question during the meeting, you can answer it. He looked at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not succeeding. You'd let me answer questions? If someone asks you what you wrote. Yes, she said. You'll know the answer. He nodded, once, with the contained but visible satisfaction of someone who has been given a real job and intends to do it correctly. Then he went and got paper. The news of the letters reached Harlan Briggs before the papers were even printed, because someone at the Missoula paper knew someone who knew a clerk at the land company's regional office, and information moved in this territory the way water moved, finding every available channel. Came back to Hamilton on a Saturday, not to the Whitmore property, but to the company's office above the hardware store on the main street, and he had 2 men with him who were not his usual riders. These men wore city clothes and carried leather satchels and had the look of lawyers, which they were. Boyd Marsh, who had not yet left Hamilton because the filing was not quite complete, saw them arrive. He sent word to Eleanor through Frank Hardin's youngest boy, who made the ride in under an hour. Eleanor read the note and showed it to Caleb and then put it in the wooden box with the other papers. They're going to try to challenge the holds, Caleb said. Probably, Eleanor said. Boyd is still here. He'll know if they file anything. And if they do, then Walt Greer has a decision to make, she said. And we need to make sure he makes it with full information. She went to see Dorothea Meeks that afternoon. This was deliberate. Dorothea Meeks's husband, August, was the largest landholder in the valley and had the informal authority that came with that, not an elected authority, not a formal one, but the weight that attaches to a person who has been in a place long enough and built enough that other people look to them when they need to know which way the wind is blowing. Eleanor had not sought Dorothea out since their exchange in the feed store in Eleanor's first week. She had not avoided her either. She had simply let time do what time does, which was to let Eleanor's presence and behavior accumulate into something that could be assessed. She rode to the Meeks place in the mid-afternoon on the Whitmore's better horse, which Caleb had saddled for her without being asked, which she noticed. The Meeks house was large by valley standards, a 2-story frame house with a covered porch, well-maintained, surrounded by the kind of established outbuildings that spoke of decades of deliberate investment. Dorothea was on the porch when Eleanor rode up, as though she had known someone was coming, which she might have news traveled in this valley faster than horses. Eleanor tied the horse and came up to the porch. Dorothea looked at her with the same frank, undecorated assessment she'd offered in the feed store 6 weeks ago. And then she said, "Come in and have coffee and tell me what you want." They sat at Dorothea's kitchen table, which was larger than Eleanor's and considerably better organized, and Eleanor laid it out without performance. She told Dorothea about the survey documents, about the boundary discrepancy, about the Helena letter and the holds and the letters she'd sent to the newspapers. She told her about the meeting she was planning. She told her what she believed the company would do next and why it mattered to every property in the valley, not just the 3 with holds on them. Dorothea listened without interrupting. She was good at listening. She did it with her full attention, which was not as common as it should have been. When Eleanor finished, Dorothea picked up her coffee, drank some, set it down. "You sent letters to the papers," she said. "Signed your name." "Yes, that takes some nerve." "It takes calculation," Eleanor said. "Nerve is doing something without thinking it through. This I thought through." Dorothea looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. "Your husband know about this?" "He knows everything," Eleanor said. "We work together." "That's not what I expected you to say," Dorothea said. "Based on the people who've been talking about you in town." "I know what they've been saying," Eleanor said. "And I've been too busy to address it," Eleanor said, "which is the correct order of priorities." Dorothea was quiet for a moment, and then she said something Eleanor had not expected. "My husband and Harlan Briggs went to school together," she said, "in St. Louis, 30 years ago. Briggs wrote to August when the company first came into this valley, 3 years ago. Said they were legitimate developers, said they'd bring investment, said it would be good for everyone." She looked at Eleanor. August believed him. Didn't do business with them directly, but he spoke well of them when people asked. Eleanor was still. "Does he know about the boundary issue?" "He didn't," Dorothea said. "He does now. I told him this morning, when I heard you'd sent those letters." She paused. He was not happy. August does not like being used to make something crooked look straight. Will he come to the meeting? Eleanor asked. He'll come, Dorothea said. And when August Meeks walks into a room in this valley, other people follow. She looked at Eleanor directly. You knew that when you came here, I hoped it, Eleanor said. I didn't know it. Dorothea studied her for a moment. You're not what people said you were, she said. I know, Eleanor said. I was never going to be able to convince them of that by arguing. I had to just be what I am and let it accumulate. Dorothea nodded slowly. Your father taught you that? Eleanor thought about it. He taught me that the numbers don't lie if you read them correctly, she said. Applied it to people. Smart, Dorothea said. Annoying probably to be around. Smart. Eleanor looked at her. Is that what you think of me? Annoying? Dorothea Meeks looked back at her with the frank, clear-eyed expression of a woman who had been through things that would have finished lesser people and had emerged with a thorough lack of interest in flattery. I think you're exactly what this valley needed to show up on a February train, she said. And I think you already know that, which is the part some people will find annoying. She picked up her coffee again. I find it refreshing. There's a shortage of women in this territory who know exactly what they're doing and don't pretend otherwise. Eleanor rode home in the late afternoon with the particular feeling of something clicking into place that had been slightly misaligned. She thought about the specific loneliness of spending years being capable in a context that didn't know what to do with that capability, and how much it mattered to finally be in a place that did. The company's lawyers filed a challenge to the holds on a Tuesday, 9 days after Greer issued them. Boyd Marsh had anticipated this. He had the counter-filing ready, which he presented to Greer's office the same afternoon. The grounds were solid. Greer held the holds and told both parties that the question would need to go to the territorial court for formal resolution, which was exactly what Boyd had been working toward. The legal clock was now running on their terms, not the company's. Briggs had one more move, and he made it on the Thursday before the Saturday meeting. He went to the Hamilton Bank and spoke to the manager, a man named Eli Pruitt, and what he said in that conversation was not directly known, but its effects were. Pruitt sent word to Caleb the following morning that the bank was formally reviewing the terms of the Whitmore Ranch's outstanding note, and that the review might result in a demand for accelerated repayment. This was the move Eleanor had been afraid of. Not the one she'd talked about publicly. She'd told Caleb about the legal pressure, the delays, the grinding process, but this specific one, the secondary pressure, the flank attack. The holds protected them from the land claim. They did not protect them from a bank calling in a note. Caleb came to her with the bank's letter, and she read it, and she sat for a moment with it in her hands and thought about what she had and what she didn't have and what the options were. $47 was not enough. The ranch's cash position was not enough. There was no good answer to this one on a financial basis. How long do we have? She asked. 30 days, Caleb said. They decide to accelerate. But Pruitt doesn't have to give me 30 days. He can call it in 10. The note has a clause. Does Pruitt have any reason to want to protect the company's interests? I don't know, Caleb said. I've always dealt with him straight. He's always seemed straight. He paused. But he's a banker, and Briggs was in his office. Eleanor thought about this. She thought about Saturday's meeting, which was now 2 days away. She thought about August Meeks, who was coming, and about what August Meeks's relationship to the Hamilton Bank might look like, because a man who had been the largest landholder in the valley for 20 years and had been in that valley for 30 years almost certainly had a substantial relationship with the only bank in the county. I need to go see August Meeks, she said. Caleb looked at her. About the bank. I'm not going to ask him to intervene, she said quickly, because she knew what it would cost Caleb's pride to have that said, and she didn't want any ambiguity about it. I'm going to tell him what just happened, because it's information he should have, about what this company is willing to do, and about what kind of man Harlan Briggs actually is. What Meeks does with that information is his decision. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Take the good horse, he said. She did. She made the ride to the Meeks place in 40 minutes, in the cold, and she told August Meeks about the bank letter in his front parlor, while Dorothea sat in the chair by the window and listened without expression. August Meeks was a large man, heavy-shouldered, with a deliberateness about him that was not slowness, but weight the quality of someone whose decisions, when they came fully. He listened to Eleanor without interrupting, and when she finished, he looked at his wife and then looked at Eleanor. Eli Pruitt owes me a considerable courtesy, he said. On account of a very difficult winter 4 years ago when I kept a substantial amount of money in that bank when I did not have to. He said it without particular emotion, as a plain statement of fact. I'll speak to him today. I'm not asking you to interfere with the banks, Eleanor started. You're not asking me anything, August said. I'm deciding to do something. Those are different. He looked at her with the measured gaze of a man who has spent decades understanding how power works and how it can be used well or badly. What Briggs is doing, using personal connections to call in a note against a ranching family with a legitimate legal dispute in process that's not business. That's punishment. I don't lend my name and my presence to people who do that. Your friendship with him, Eleanor said. We went to school together 30 years ago, August said. That doesn't make us friends. That makes us people who used to know each other. He stood. Come to the meeting on Saturday, both of you. Don't worry about the note between now and then. Eleanor rode home and told Caleb. He was quiet for a long time. You're very good at this, he said finally. Not admiringly, exactly. More like a man coming to terms with the full dimensions of something he'd been living with for 6 weeks and was still measuring. At what? Eleanor asked, though she knew what he meant. At understanding what each person has and what they need and how those two things connect, he said. You do it without making anyone feel managed. People don't like feeling managed, she said, but they do like being understood. He looked at her. Do you do it with me? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I try not to, she said. You'd notice. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Would I? Yes. She said, you notice most things. You just don't always say so. He didn't argue with that. Saturday came with the particular Montana cold that had a personality to it, not brutal, not the killing cold of deep January, but persistent and clear, the kind that made the light bright and sharp, and the distances look longer than they were. By 10 in the morning, there were already 3 wagons tied at the Whitmore fence, and by 11 there were 9, and by the time Eleanor had the kitchen fully open and the benches from the barn set up in the main room and the yard, there were 26 people in and around the house, which was more than she had hoped for and more than the space was designed to hold comfortably. August and Dorothea Meeks had come early, which Eleanor had privately counted on, because their presence before the meeting started communicated something to everyone who arrived. After this was not a desperate family asking for help. This was a valley concern that the valley's most established people took seriously. Frank Hardin came with his wife and his older son. Collier boy, his name was Daniel, she'd learned, and he was 22 and not as slow as Caleb had suggested, just deliberate in a way that read as slowness until you saw him working, came with his mother Margaret, who was a small, quiet woman with the specific stillness of someone who had absorbed a great deal and was containing it carefully. Marta Gruen came from the dry goods store. Lottie came with her, eyes wide with the excitement of someone who has been adjacent to a story and is about to see it unfold. 3 other families from further up the valley made the ride. School teacher came. A man named Gordon, who ran the livery in town, came and stood in the yard because there was no room inside and said that was fine, he was used to cold. Boyd Marsh stood near the back of the main room with his satchel and his small notepad. Thomas stood near the window with his carefully copied documents, which he had written out over 3 days, with the focused, unhurried attention of a boy who had been given a real job and intended to do it correctly. His handwriting was, in fact, large enough to be read at a distance, which turned out to be useful. He had asked Eleanor twice, during the copying, to explain specific things he didn't understand, and both times she had explained them fully and without condescension, and he had nodded and gone back to writing with the look of someone who is building a structure in their mind and wants it to be sound. Clara was in the loft, from which she had a clear view of the main room, and from which she watched everything with the wide, grave attention of a 6-year-old who understands that something important is happening and intends to remember it. Caleb stood at the front of the room and waited until the noise settled. He did not call for quiet, he just waited, and the particular quality of his waiting was the kind that drew attention without demanding it. The stillness of a man who has learned that patience is more effective than volume. When the room came to quiet, he said, "Thank you for coming. I'm going to let my wife explain why we asked you here." He stepped back. Eleanor stepped forward. She had thought carefully about how to begin. Not with the legal argument, that was the middle, not the start. She began where the story actually started, which was not with the documents or the survey or the company. She began with a winter morning and a man on a horse who had ridden onto this property without knocking. She described Harlan Briggs's first visit with the exactness of someone who had been told about it in precise detail and had thought about it many times since. She described the document he'd held open and read aloud, like a man explaining something to someone who might not understand the longer words. She described the 6-week deadline, and she watched the room as she described it, and she saw in several faces the particular expression of recognition people who had had their own version of that visit or who knew someone who had. Then she told them what was behind it. Not quickly, carefully, in sequence, building from the foundation up the way her father had taught her to present a survey, the original territorial grant, the 1,882 baseline survey, county deed registration and its 61-foot discrepancy, her father's resurvey in 1,886, and what he'd found in the margins, the Helena letter that confirmed it, the water access at the north end of the boundary strip, and why that was what this was actually about. She put Thomas's copies up where people could see them while she talked. The room was very quiet. She showed them the pattern of which properties had been targeted and why those specific properties, all in the boundary zone, all with the water access issue, all with debt situations that the company had known about before they moved. She showed them, without being able to prove intent, that this was not opportunistic. It was deliberate. It had been planned. When she finished the evidentiary part, she stepped back slightly, not surrendering the floor, just giving the room a moment to breathe, and Boyd Marsh stepped forward and explained the legal situation in plain language. The holds, the territorial court process, what the filing meant, and what it would accomplish and how long it would take. Then August Meeks, from the back of the room, said in the particular voice of a man who rarely speaks in groups because he does not need to, "I want to be clear about something. This company approached me 3 years ago as a legitimate developer. I spoke positively about them to people in this valley because I believed what I was told. I was wrong, and I'm saying so." He paused. "The people in this room who have been pressured you were not foolish. You were deceived by people who knew exactly what they were doing." The room was very still. Frank Harden said from his bench, "What do we need to do?" Eleanor looked at him. "Support the legal filing. If any of you have records of interactions with the company letters, notices, any documents they sent you, give copies to Boyd Marsh. The more complete the pattern, the stronger the case in territorial court." She paused and talked to each other. "Stop letting them work on you one at a time. That's how this stops working for them." Daniel Collier, who had been listening with the careful attention of someone building a full picture before speaking, raised his hand slightly. "The water rights," he said. "If the boundary is corrected, what happens to the water access?" "It stays with the properties as originally granted," Eleanor said. "All 3 of them. That's what the original territorial grant specifies." Daniel nodded slowly, processing this. His mother, Margaret, beside him, put her hand on his arm without looking at him. Dorothea Meeks, from her chair, said to no one in particular, "She's been here 6 weeks." Nobody responded to this directly, because nobody needed to. The room held the statement and let it settle where it would. The meeting ended 2 hours later, and people lingered in the way that people linger after something that has been real, not rushing away, taking time with each other, talking in the yard in small groups while the cold air made their breath visible. Boyd Marsh sat at the kitchen table and collected documents from 4 families who had brought things they hadn't known were relevant until today. Caleb stood near the barn and talked with Frank Harden for 20 minutes, and when they came back toward the house, they were walking the way men walk when something that was broken has been set, not healed yet, but aligned in the right direction. Margaret Collier came to Eleanor before she left and took her hand in both of hers and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "My husband left me that land. He worked it for 15 years. The idea that someone was going to take it," she stopped. "Thank you," she said. "That's all." "Don't thank me yet," Eleanor said. "It's not over," I know, Margaret said. "But this is different from what it was a month ago. That matters." She left with her son, and Eleanor watched them go, and then she felt a small weight at her side and looked down and found Clara there, who had come down from the loft at some point and had apparently decided that standing next to Eleanor was where she wanted to be. Clara looked up at her with that particular grave expression, the one that did not entirely hide that she was also proud, in the specific way of children who are proud of someone they have decided to attach themselves to. "Talked for a long time," Clara said. "I did," Eleanor agreed. "Did it work?" Eleanor looked at the yard full of people and the wagons that were slowly beginning to leave, and Boyd Marsh inside with his notepad and the fire going, and Thomas carefully stacking his copied documents with precision of a boy who had done something real. "We'll see," she said, because that was the honest answer. But it was the right thing to do. Clara thought about this, and then she slid her hand into Eleanor's, which was a thing she had done before, once, when she was sick, and had not done again until now. Eleanor looked down at the small hand in hers and did not make a thing of it. She just held it. Outside, the wagons rolled away down the lane one by one, and the valley opened out around the house in the cold, bright afternoon. And Caleb came and stood on the other side of Eleanor and looked at the same thing she was looking at, which was the lane and the land and the mountains beyond it, and did not speak, because some things are better held without words, and they both knew that. The territorial court hearing was scheduled for the 14th of June, which was 4 months, and 12 days after Walt Greer had issued the holds, and which arrived with the particular quality of a date that has been lived toward for so long it begins to feel less like a point on a calendar, and more like a thing you have been building with your hands. The spring had come in the way Montana spring always came, reluctantly, incrementally, with several false starts that dropped another 4 inches of snow just when the ground was beginning to soften, as though the season was testing your conviction before it committed. Eleanor had learned this about the territory in those months. It did not give you anything easily. It made you demonstrate repeatedly that you intended to stay. She had stayed. That was the fact of it, though it sounds simpler than it was. The months between February and June had not been quiet. The company's lawyers had filed 3 separate procedural challenges to the holds, each designed not to win outright but to delay and complicate, to add costs and uncertainty to a process that Boyd Marsh was running on a shoestring from Missoula. Boyd had countered all 3. The Helena Independent had run Eleanor's letter in early March under a headline that was more dramatic than she would have chosen, and the Missoula paper had run it the following week with a follow-up piece that named the Consolidated Western Land Company and described the boundary discrepancy in enough detail that the company's regional manager, a man named Pruitt, who had never actually appeared in this valley, but whose name appeared on company correspondence, had sent a legal notice to both papers demanding correction. Both papers declined. The story had legs, as Boyd put it, and legs meant it was harder to bury. Eli Pruitt at the Hamilton Bank had not called in the Whitmore note. August Meeks had spoken to him, and whatever was said in that conversation was between those 2 men. But the effect was that the bank's review of the note's terms concluded that the terms were sound as written, and no acceleration was warranted. Pruitt had the look of a man who had been given a clear view of where certain roads led and had chosen a different road, and Eleanor did not judge him for it. She simply noted it and moved on. The garden had come up in May, better than she'd hoped. The soil her predecessor had built over years of careful tending had not forgotten how to work. It had needed breaking open, feeding, coaxing back into productivity, and Eleanor had done all of that with Thomas's help on the weekends, and Clara's very particular form of assistance, which mostly consisted of strong opinions about where things should go and a genuine willingness to carry water. The raised beds that May Whitmore had built with such clear competence were producing beans, onions, the first green shoots of potato plants, and a row of squash that Eleanor had planted along the south-facing fence where they'd get the most of the short season's warmth. She thought about May Whitmore, sometimes when she was in that garden, not with guilt or with the specific anxiety of a woman trying to measure herself against a predecessor. She had done enough of that in the early weeks and had made a deliberate decision to stop because it was not useful and because the children needed a present person, not a person perpetually gauging herself against an absence. But she thought about her with something more like respect. The bones of this place, the garden beds, the way the root cellar was laid out, the informal agreement with the Hardins about the creek that had kept water access through 2 bad summers, all of it spoke of someone who had understood the land and worked it intelligently. Eleanor was not replacing that. She was building on it, which was a different thing, and one she'd had to arrive at honestly, rather than assume. Caleb had not said much about May, directly, since the early weeks. He was not a man who processed things out loud. He processed them in the ongoing behavior of his daily life, in the way he worked and made decisions and treated people, and Eleanor had learned to read this in him, the way you learn to read a particular landscape, understanding where solid ground was and where the soft spots were and how to move accordingly. What she had observed over those 4 months was that the quality of his grief had changed. Not disappeared grief of that kind does not disappear. She knew this from her own experience with her father, but it had become something he carried differently, less like a weight that pressed him down, and more like something he'd integrated into the structure of how he stood. He slept better. He laughed more, not often, but more. He had opinions about the garden that he voiced without being asked. These were small things, and they were also not small at all. Thomas had by April stopped being careful around Eleanor. This happened gradually, and then all at once, the way most real changes happen incremental, and then suddenly visible. The arithmetic sessions had continued, happening naturally 2 or 3 evenings a week, and had expanded from arithmetic to geography, and then, at Thomas's direction, to the survey documents themselves, which he had asked Eleanor to teach him to read properly. She had taught him. He learned quickly, and with the focused retention of a child who is interested in something real rather than something assigned. And by May, he could look at a survey notation and tell her what it meant, which was a thing that had made his father look at him with an expression. Eleanor did not think Caleb knew was on his face. Clara had stopped being careful around Eleanor on approximately the 3rd day, which was a different timeline entirely, and said everything about the difference between the 2 children. Clara's attachment was immediate, but physical, and entirely without self-consciousness. She had decided Eleanor was hers and acted accordingly, with the blithe confidence of a 6-year-old who does not yet understand that relationships are supposed to be complicated. Eleanor had accepted this with the same practical steadiness she brought to everything, and if there were moments, private ones, when she held that small hand or read that same passage for the 4th time, and felt something in her chest that she did not have a fully adequate word for, she let those moments be what they were without requiring them to be named. The hearing in Helena required 3 days of travel each way, which meant Caleb and Eleanor were gone for 9 days in total, the longest either of them had been away from the ranch since Eleanor arrived, and the longest the children had been in someone else's care. Dorothea Meeks had offered, without being asked, and with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who organizes things because they need organizing, to have Thomas and Clara at the Meeks place during the absence. Thomas had received this information with careful neutrality. Clara had received it with excitement because the Meeks place had a dog. The night before they left, Eleanor sat with both children at the kitchen table after supper, not to reassure them with speech. She had learned that children find extended reassurance more unsettling than helpful, because it signals that the situation requires more reassurance than they'd realized, but simply to be present in the ordinary way. They played a card game. Clara cheated openly and without guilt. Thomas caught her and said so, and Clara denied it with the serene confidence of someone who does not believe the rules apply to her. Caleb watched this from the chair by the fire with the expression of a man who has this particular scene running in his house for the first time in 16 months and is taking it in without looking like he's taking it in. When the children were in the loft, Eleanor sat across from Caleb and said, "If something goes wrong in Helena, if the court doesn't hold, if the company's lawyers find something we haven't anticipated, then we fight the next stage." Caleb said, "I know. I just want to say it out loud, so we've both said it." She looked at him. "This doesn't end the fight even in the best case. Boyd said the company could appeal. It could go on for another year." "I know what Boyd said," Caleb said. "I was there." "I know you were," she said. "I just need to say the hard version out loud sometimes. It helps me think." He looked at her, and there was something in the way he looked, a steadiness that was not performed, that came from the same place as everything else about him, which was a core of settled conviction that had been formed by hard experience and was not going anywhere. "We have the documents," he said. "We have Boyd. We have the Helena survey baseline. We have 4 other families with documentation of the same pattern. What happens in that courtroom is going to be decided by what's true, and what's true is on our side." He paused. "Your father did his work correctly. We do ours correctly. The rest isn't in our hands." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "You sound very certain," she said. "I'm not certain," he said. "I just decided a while ago that the alternative to acting like it might work is to act like it won't, and I know where that road goes. I've been on it." He met her eyes. "I'm not going back on it." She held his gaze and then nodded once, the way she nodded when something had been said that she found both true and sufficient. "Right," she said. "We leave at first light." They left at first light. The territorial court in Helena was housed in a brick building on the main street that had the weight and solidity of a place that took itself seriously, which Eleanor found, on balance, reassuring. The presiding judge was a man named Horatio Vance, who was 58 years old and had been on the territorial bench for 11 years, and had the reputation, Boyd had researched this carefully, of being rigidly impartial, deeply allergic to procedural manipulation, and possessed of the specific compressed irritability of a man who has no patience for cases where the evidence is clear, and the process has been deliberately complicated to obscure that clarity. The company had sent 2 lawyers from Chicago. They were polished, well-prepared, and operated with the smooth efficiency of men who had done this kind of work many times before in many different territories. They were not bad lawyers. They were good lawyers in service of a bad cause, which was a different problem than bad lawyers, because their skill was real, even if their foundation was not. Boyd Marsh, by contrast, was one man with a satchel and 20 years of experience, and the survey documents and the Helena baseline record, and signed statements from 5 Valley families describing the company's pattern of approach statements he had gathered over 4 months with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood that the accumulation of specific details was more powerful in a court than any single dramatic piece of evidence. The hearing lasted 2 days. Eleanor sat behind Boyd at the counsel table, which was not standard. She was not an attorney, but which Boyd had arranged with Judge Vance in advance, explaining that the primary evidence involved survey documents whose technical content required someone who understood them to be available for immediate reference. Vance had agreed, with the look of a man who found the arrangement slightly irregular, and was going to allow it because it was sensible. The company's lawyers presented their position first. The boundary discrepancy, they argued, was a clerical matter, long-standing, and was being selectively elevated to a legal dispute by parties with a financial interest in delaying legitimate debt recovery. They were fluent. They used the word technical 9 times in the first hour, each time in a way that was designed to suggest that technical concerns were small concerns, bureaucratic concerns, kind that sophisticated parties resolved privately rather than bringing before a court. Judge Vance listened without expression. Boyd presented the survey evidence in the order. Eleanor had helped him arrange foundation first. The 1,882 baseline, then the county register, then the discrepancy, then James Whittaker's 1,886 resurvey and its annotations, then the pattern of acquisition. He was methodical and he was clear, and when the company's lawyers objected to specific documents on technical grounds, Boyd had the foundation laid so carefully that the objections found no purchase. On the afternoon of the second day, Judge Vance asked a question that was addressed to the room generally, but was clearly aimed at the company's representation. He asked whether the company had conducted any survey of their own, of the boundary in question, prior to initiating their acquisition claims. The lead lawyer said the company had relied on the recorded county deed, which was standard practice. Judge Vance said that was interesting, given that the same county deed register contained a flagged discrepancy notice that had been filed in 1,887 and never resolved, which a competent search of the register would have surfaced. He said this in the tone of a man reading from a page, which he was, and the page was Boyd Marsh's exhibit list, and the flagged notice was something Eleanor had found in the county recorder's files during a search she had conducted in March and had given to Boyd without ceremony, because that was the kind of thing you found when you looked carefully, and she had looked carefully. The source said the company was not aware of the 1,887 notice. Judge Vance looked at him for a moment. "That is the most useful thing you've said today," he said, and went back to his note. The ruling came on the morning of the 3rd day, before they were scheduled to leave Helena. Vance issued it in writing, which Boyd read in the courthouse hallway, with Eleanor standing beside him, and Caleb standing slightly behind both of them with his hat in his hands, which was what he did when he was waiting for something important. The boundary discrepancy was real, documented, and materially significant. County deed register for the affected section required formal correction consistent with the 1,882 territorial baseline survey and confirmed by the 1,886 resurvey. The Consolidated Western Land Company's acquisition claims against the Whitmore, Hardin, and Collier properties were invalid as filed, predicated on deed descriptions that did not accurately reflect the original territorial grants. The holds were converted to permanent injunctions against the claims. The company was ordered to file a corrected deed registration within 90 days or face further proceedings. The 1,887 discrepancy notice filed by James Whittaker, licensed surveyor, was entered into the official court record as the originating documentation of the dispute. Boyd lowered the paper. He looked at Eleanor. His face was doing something restrained. He was not a demonstrative man, but the restraint was working hard. "Your father's name is in the territorial court record," he said. Eleanor stood in the courthouse hallway and heard this, and did not look away from Boyd, and did not say anything for a moment, because the moment required more than she had immediately available to put into words. Her father had filed that report 8 years ago and watched it be set aside, and had spent 3 years of correspondence trying to make something happen with it, and had died without seeing it mean anything. And now his name was in the record. The thing he had found and documented and tried to make matter had mattered. "Good," she said finally. Her voice was even. It was the only way she had of handling certain things. Hold them steady. Let them be true. Don't perform the size of them. Caleb put his hand on her shoulder and left it there. They came back to Hamilton on a Thursday afternoon to find that the news had arrived before them. Boyd had sent a telegraph to Frank Harden, who had told everyone, because Frank Harden was apparently more communicative than his manner suggested when the communication was worth making. There were people on the main street who stopped and nodded at Eleanor when she came through in the wagon, and Lottie Gruen came out of the dry goods store and said simply, "Well done," with the warm directness of someone who had been rooting for a particular outcome for months, and was glad to have been right. Gordon from the livery tipped his hat, which was not a gesture he deployed frequently. Dorothea Meeks, when Eleanor came for the children the following morning, handed her a jar of preserved plums and said that she had read the Helena Independent's coverage of the hearing and that the paper had done a reasonable job of explaining the technical elements, which from Dorothea was considerable praise. She also said that Thomas had helped her fix a broken hinge on the back gate while Eleanor was away, correctly diagnosing the problem and suggesting the right approach before being asked, which Dorothea reported with the satisfaction of someone confirming a prior assessment. Clara had, at some point during the 9 days, taught the Meeks dog to sit on command and was as grieved to leave without it. The ranch work continued, but because it always did, the cattle needed tending, and the garden needed tending, and the fence in the northwest corner that Caleb had been patching with wire since October needed to be properly replaced before the season turned. Eleanor and Caleb worked it together on a Saturday in late June, digging post holes in the thawed earth, while Thomas carried posts from the pile, and Clara made her opinions about post placement known in a running commentary from the fence rail. It was not romantic work. It was muddy and hard, and Eleanor broke a blister on her left hand that she bandaged without mentioning and kept working. By noon, they had the northwest section done properly for the first time in 2 years. They sat on the ground and ate the lunch Eleanor had packed and looked at the fence line, which was, objectively, just a fence, and both of them knew it was not just a fence. "Your father would have liked this valley," Caleb said. Eleanor thought about this. "He would have liked the survey problem," she said. "He would have found the whole situation professionally fascinating and personally infuriating, which was his usual relationship with his work." She paused. "He would have liked you." Caleb looked at her sideways. "Why?" "Because you say what you mean, and you don't say more than you mean," she said. He had a low tolerance for excess. He thought most problems in the world came from people saying more than they were sure of. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Smart man, he was," she said simply. Thomas, who had been listening in his way present, apparently occupied with his lunch, registering everything, said, "What did he look like?" Eleanor looked at him. Medium height, brown hair that went gray early at the temples first. He wore glasses for reading. He had a habit of tapping his pen on his knee when he was thinking. She paused. He was the kind of person who made you feel like whatever you said was worth listening to. Thomas considered this. "You're like that," he said. Eleanor looked at him, and the straightforwardness of it, the unguarded, factual delivery of a 9-year-old saying something true without strategy or performance, landed in her chest in the specific way that certain true things do when they come without warning. "Thank you," she said. Thomas shrugged, already looking away, the way children do when they've said something real and prefer not to watch it being received. Clara, who had been eating her bread and butter with complete focus, looked up and said, "I think you look like you," which was her contribution to the conversation, and everyone accepted it as the reasonable point it was. The formal correction of the county deed register happened in August, 81 days after the court order, which was 9 days under the deadline the company had been given. It was not a dramatic event. Walt Greer made the corrections in his office with Boyd Marsh and a notary present, and Caleb and Eleanor stood in the office and signed the acknowledgement of the corrected deed description and Greer stamped everything with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for an irregularity in his records to be resolved and is glad to see it done. The corrected deed was placed in the register. The 61-foot discrepancy, which had sat in the county records since the 1870s, was gone. Eleanor held the certified copy of the corrected deed on the way home in the wagon. She didn't look at it constantly, she had it in her lap, and her hands rested on it, and she looked at the valley instead, at the land that was legally and precisely what it had always actually been, correctly described at last. The Consolidated Western Land Company, she said. Will they come back? Boyd thinks not to this valley, Caleb said. Too much public record now. Too much documented. They'll find somewhere else. He looked at the road ahead. There'll be someone in that, somewhere else, who needs to do what you did. Someone will, Eleanor said, hopefully with better documents to start from. Your father's name is in the territorial record, Caleb said. Anyone who looks into this territory's land history from now forward will find it. She didn't respond immediately. She looked at the mountains to the east, which were showing the first faint suggestion of early fall color at the highest elevations, the aspens beginning their turn. She had been in this valley for 7 months. She knew the names of the mountains now, and the names of the families, and which stretch of the creek ran fast and which ran slow, and she knew what the frost smelled like coming off the north pasture before dawn. And she knew the sound the house made in the wind versus what it sounded like when the wind was not the cause. She knew this place. It knew her, in whatever way places know people, which is through accumulated presence and through the work done in them and the decisions made about them. He would have been glad, she said finally, that it mattered. It mattered, Caleb said, all of it, from the beginning. She looked at him. He was watching the road with the steady, forward attention of a man who has somewhere to be and intends to get there, and she thought about the advertisement he had placed in October the Plain, slightly desperate 2 sentences. The fair treatment, certain that had struck her, when she first read it, as the most honest thing about it, and she thought about what it was to answer a call like that, to cross hundreds of miles toward a place, and a person you did not know, with a suitcase and a dead man's papers, and a promise you had made to yourself. She had not come looking for this specifically. She had come looking for a situation where her efforts would matter, and she had been more right than she'd known. There is something worth saying about that, about the gap between what we set out to find and what we actually find, and how the best arrivals are often the ones we didn't precisely plan. Eleanor had not planned Caleb. She had not planned Thomas's careful 9-year-old trust, arrived at by small increments over months, or Clara's immediate and blithe attachment, or the specific quality of a kitchen table with lamplight on survey documents, and 2 people arguing about the order of an argument until they found something better than either version. She had not planned to feel by June that this valley was hers not in the legal sense of the corrected deed, though that mattered too, but in the deeper, harder to document sense of belonging to a place because you have put your hands into it and it has asked things of you, and you have answered. People talk about finding a home as though it is a discovery, a thing you locate and then possess. In Eleanor's experience, and she had thought about this enough to have a view, it was not that. It was more like what her father did with a survey, patient, methodical accumulation of accurate measurements, repeated reference checks, willingness to correct errors when you found them, and at the end, if you had done the work correctly, a record that matched the truth of what was actually there. You did not find a home. You built the accurate description of one measurement at a time until the record and the reality matched. She had been doing that work since February. She was still doing it. She expected she would be doing it for a long time, which was not a burden. It was the work she had come here to do, even if she had not known that when she came. In September, the Valley held a gathering at the Grange Hall not organized by Eleanor, which was notable, but organized by Marta Gruen and Dorothea Meeks and Frank Hardin's wife Ruth, who had apparently decided among themselves that something should be marked, even if what it was hard to put a name to. It was not a celebration exactly. It was more like the Valley acknowledging itself, gathering in the way communities gather when they have been through something together and survived it and want to be in the same room for a moment before going back to the ordinary work. Eleanor and Caleb came with Thomas and Clara, who was wearing the good dress again and had braided her own hair without asking for help, which Eleanor noticed and did not comment on, because Clara was watching to see if she would comment on it and had already decided that not commenting would be the correct response. Frank Hardin shook Caleb's hand and then turned to Eleanor and said, My wife wants to ask you something about preserving when you have time. She says you told Margaret Collier something about dry pack methods that Margaret tried, and she wants to know the whole of it. Eleanor said she'd be glad to. Margaret Collier was there with Daniel, who had grown into his own sin somewhat over the summer. There was more ease in him, less of the careful deliberateness that had read as slowness. Came over and said the squash in his mother's garden had done well this year and that she'd asked him to say thank you to Eleanor for whatever she'd told her about the soil preparation in spring. Eleanor said it was the method her father's sister had used in New York, and it seemed to travel well. August Meeks came and stood with Caleb for a while, and they talked about cattle prices and the coming winter's outlook, and at some point August said something in a low voice that made Caleb nod slowly and look at the floor and then look up again. And Eleanor did not know what was said, but she knew what that particular nod meant, which was that something true had been spoken and received. Boyd Marsh had written to say he couldn't make the gathering. Missoula had a case that wouldn't wait, but had sent a letter that Caleb read aloud to the room at some point in the evening, which described the territorial court outcome and its implications for land claims in the region, in Boyd's characteristic compressed style, and which ended with a single sentence that said, "The work that was done in this valley this winter, by the people in this room, is the kind of work that makes the law mean something. I am glad to have been part of it." There were a few people in the room who had found Eleanor's arrival strange or suspect, and some of them were here tonight, and the dynamic had the slightly careful quality of a thing not fully resolved, which was honest, and Eleanor preferred honest to falsely smooth. Trust in a community is not built in a court hearing or a single winter. It is built the same way everything real is built, which is slowly and with repetition, and she was a patient woman. Thomas found her near the end of the evening, standing slightly apart from the main noise of the room. He stood beside her and did not say anything for a moment, in the way he sometimes did when he was preparing something. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About what you said. That your father taught you to read things twice before you answered." He paused. "I've been doing that with the lessons. Is it helping?" "Yes," he said. "My teacher said my work has improved." He said this in the tone of someone reporting data rather than seeking praise. And then, because he was 9 and the data led somewhere, she asked what changed. "Told her you showed me." Eleanor looked at him. "What did she say?" "She said that was good." He thought about it. "She seemed surprised. Because she didn't know you had someone helping you?" "Because she didn't know you were—" He stopped. "She knew you were here. She didn't know you were like this." Eleanor waited. "Like someone who actually explains things," he said, with the precision of a child who has found the right words and will not use more than he needs, instead of just telling you to do them differently. She thought about her father, about the long afternoons in his office, when he had explained survey notation and land measurement and the logic of boundary law to a girl who had not asked to learn these things, but who had learned them because he explained them as though they mattered, and as though she was capable of understanding, both of which turned out to be true and to have mattered enormously. "Someone explained things to me," she said. "I'm just passing it on." Thomas nodded. He looked at the room, at his father talking with August Meeks, at Clara, who had found the Grange Hall's single resident cat and was engaged in a focused negotiation with it, at the gathered people of this valley who had been, 6 months ago, strangers to Eleanor, and who were now something less simple than that. "I'm glad you came," he said. He said it the way he said most things, which was quietly and without embellishment, and then he walked back toward his father, and Eleanor watched him go and stood for a moment with the plain, declarative weight of what he had said. She was glad, too. She was glad in the complicated, honestly arrived at way, that she was glad for most things, not because it had been easy or because it had gone as planned, because it had been neither, but because it had been real, and real was what she had come here looking for, even if she hadn't known to call it that. Outside the Grange Hall, the September air was cold and clear and smelled of the coming season, and the mountains stood against the dark sky the way they always did, massive and permanent and entirely indifferent to the small human business happening at their feet, which was also, Eleanor had come to understand, part of why she loved them. They did not require anything of you. They were just there, and they were true, and in a world full of people and documents and claims and counterclaims, there was something steadying about a thing that simply was what it was and made no argument about it. She would go back inside in a moment. Caleb would look up and find her, and they would drive home in the cold dark with the children in the wagon bed. And tomorrow the work would begin again as it always did, and the winter would come as it always did, and she would be here for it. which was the whole of what she had promised when she answered that plain, honest advertisement, and which was, she had found, more than enough. She stood a moment longer in the clear September dark, and then she went back inside.